The pickup truck was a 2005 Ford F-150, the kind that had seen better decades. James Lattimer sat behind the wheel, hands gripping tight at 10 and 2 like they'd taught him in driver's ed 40 years ago, back when the world made sense. The Wyoming highway stretched ahead, empty and white under a February sky that looked like old concrete. Snow had fallen the night before, turning the landscape into something clean and forgiving, hiding all the scars underneath. Jim was 52 years old. He felt 80. The heater rattled, blowing air that smelled like dust and antifreeze. On the passenger seat sat everything he owned. A duffel bag from his first deployment in 1991, a cardboard box with 3 picture frames face down, and a manila envelope containing his discharge papers, medical records, and a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs that he had not opened. The letter had been sitting there for 3 weeks. Some things you put off reading because you already know what they say. He took the exit for Redemption Ridge without signaling. There was no one behind him. There was rarely anyone behind him anymore. The town appeared like a memory half forgotten, the kind of place that existed on maps but barely in real life. One stoplight, a grain elevator that hadn't operated since the 80s, a diner with Christmas lights still up in February, which meant either the owner was lazy or the owner had stopped caring about the difference between seasons. Jim understood that. When you've seen enough, time stops being months and years. It just becomes before and after. Before the war, after the war. Before Marcus died, after Marcus died. Before he lost his family, after he lost his family. The GPS on his phone, cracked screen held together with packing tape, directed him 5 miles outside town. The road turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt. Fence posts appeared, leaning at angles that suggested they'd been standing since before Jim was born. A wooden sign, hand-painted, weathered, Redemption Ridge Ranch. Underneath in smaller letters, where second chances live. Jim almost turned around right there. He'd tried second chances before. They had a way of turning into third and fourth and fifth chances, each one smaller than the last, each one proving what he already knew. Some men were too broken to fix. But the tank was nearly empty, and the cold was setting in, and he'd driven 18 hours straight from a Texas town he'd never go back to, running from a night security job he'd quit after the manager asked him why his hands trembled when he held the flashlight. So Jim turned down the drive. The ranch house was old, probably built in the 30s, with additions tacked on over the decades in different materials and colors that told a story of survival and stubbornness. Smoke rose from a chimney. Horses stood in paddocks, their breath making clouds in the cold air. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped, then started again like it couldn't decide if strangers were worth the effort. Jim parked next to a Chevy from the 90s and a tractor that looked older than both trucks combined. He sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching the house. This was the part where normal people would rehearse what to say. Jim had stopped being normal somewhere between his second tour and his third marriage. The front door opened before he reached it. The woman who stepped onto the porch was small, maybe 5'3", with white hair pulled back in a bun, and a face that had earned every one of its lines. She wore jeans, work boots, and a canvas jacket that had seen decades of hard use. Her eyes were blue and sharp, and saw right through whatever story Jim thought he might tell. "You're late," she said. Jim stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Ma'am." "Advertisement said to call first. You didn't call." "I don't use phones much." "You drove 18 hours without confirming the job was still available." It wasn't a question. She'd already read him, the way only certain people could. "That means you had nowhere else to go." Jim said nothing. The dog, an Australian Shepherd mix with a graying muzzle, trotted over and sniffed his boots. It sat down, looked up at him, then back at the woman and made a small sound that seemed to mean, "This one's okay." "I'm Margaret Henson," the woman said. "People call me Maggie. You look like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time." "Yes, ma'am." "Can you lift 50-pound feed bags?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you work with horses that don't trust easy?" Jim looked past her at the paddocks, at the horses standing separate from each other, each in its own space. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and meant it. Maggie studied him for a long moment. The wind moved through the bare cottonwood trees, making sounds like water. "What's your name?" "James Lattimer. People called me Jim." "Called past tense." "Been a while since people called me much of anything." Maggie nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she already suspected. "Well, Jim, I can offer $800 a month plus room and board. Bunkhouse out back. Not fancy, but it's warm and dry. Work starts at 5:30, ends when it ends. Days off when we can afford them." "That's fine." "I didn't tell you what the work was yet." "Doesn't matter." "It should." Maggie stepped down off the porch, moving carefully on knees that had their own stories to tell. She was shorter than Jim had realized, but she had the presence of someone twice her size. "This isn't a regular ranch. We take horses nobody else wants. The ones that bite, kick, charge. The ones other places put down because it's easier than fixing them. Some of them came from good homes that fell apart. Some came from places that never should have existed. All of them have been hurt. All of them remember." Jim watched the horses. They watched him back. "We don't break them here," Maggie continued. "We help them remember they were never really broken, just bent. Takes patience. Takes time. Takes understanding that fear looks like anger when you don't know the difference." She paused. "You understand what I'm saying?" "Yes, ma'am." "You ever work with horses before?" "No, ma'am. Dogs, military working dogs, explosives detection." "What war?" "All of them." Maggie's expression shifted, something crossing her face too quick to name but familiar enough that Jim recognized it. Every veteran knew that look. The one that said, "Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry for what it cost." "The bunkhouse is unlocked," she said. "Get settled, dinner's at 6. We can talk details then." Jim nodded and turned back to his truck. "Jim," Maggie's voice stopped him. "The job advertisement, you said you don't use phones much, so how'd you find us?" "VA counselor gave me a printout. Said sometimes working with animals helps with." He didn't finish. "With coming home when you're still deployed in your head," Maggie finished for him. "Your counselor was right. Get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in a month." Try 18 years, Jim thought, but he just nodded and walked back to his truck. The bunkhouse was a long, low building that had probably housed ranch hands since the 40s. Inside, it was clean and simple. 4 bunks, only one showing signs of recent use. A wood stove with a neat stack of split logs beside it. A bathroom with a shower that had been updated sometime in the last decade. And a small kitchen area with a table, 2 chairs, and a coffee maker that looked older than Jim. The walls were bare, except for a calendar from 2019, and a faded photograph of the ranch from what looked like the 70s. Jim took the bunk farthest from the door. Old habits, always know your exits, always keep your back to the wall, always wake up ready. He unpacked in under 5 minutes, clothes in the locker, toiletries in the bathroom. The cardboard box with the picture frame stayed in the truck. He wasn't ready for faces looking at him yet. Maybe tomorrow, maybe never. He sat on the bunk and felt the exhaustion hit him like a physical thing. 18 hours driving. Before that, 3 weeks of sleeping in the truck in a Walmart parking lot outside Amarillo. Before that, 6 months at a storage facility where the night manager let him sleep in the office for $100 a week under the table. Before that, too many before that's to count. Jim lay back, fully clothed, boots still on, and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere outside, a horse made a sound, not quite a whinny, more like a question. Another horse answered, or maybe it was the wind. His eyes closed. He was asleep in 30 seconds. He woke to screaming. Not human screaming, horse screaming. The kind of sound that bypassed thinking and went straight to the part of the brain that understood terror. Jim was on his feet and out the door before he was fully conscious, moving on instinct and training, the same way he'd moved in Fallujah and Kandahar, and a dozen other places where hesitation meant death. The cold hit him like a slap. The sun was lower, painting everything orange and red. He'd slept 3 hours, maybe 4. The screaming came from behind the main barn, where the paddock spread out in a rough semicircle. Jim ran toward it, boots slipping in the snow, and came around the corner to find 3 men backing away from a fence, faces pale, one of them cradling his arm against his chest. Inside the paddock, a horse stood alone. It was huge, easily 17 hands, maybe more. A Mustang, Jim guessed, though he didn't know horses the way he knew dogs. Its coat was gray fading to white, marked with scars that told stories Jim understood without needing translation. Old scars, thick and ropey across the shoulders and flanks. Newer scars on the legs. And one eye, the right one, clouded over with the white of permanent damage. The horse stood absolutely still, sides heaving, nostrils flared, the one good eye fixed on the men with an intensity that was part rage and part something else. Something Jim recognized because he saw it in the mirror every morning. Pure, unfiltered fear pretending to be strength. "Get back," that was Maggie's voice, sharp and commanding. She appeared from the barn, moving faster than a 68-year-old woman should move. "All of you back to the barn, now." The men retreated. The one cradling his arm was younger, maybe late 30s, with the build of someone who worked outdoors. Blood seeped between his fingers. "Ben, get to the house. First aid kit under the sink. Sarah, call Doc Morrison. Tell him we might need stitches." Maggie's voice was calm but absolute. People obeyed her the way soldiers obeyed officers who'd earned their authority in fire. Jim stood 20 feet from the fence, not moving, barely breathing. The horse's attention shifted to him. The good eye locked on. The horse didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched. "That's Phantom," Maggie said quietly. She'd appeared beside Jim without him noticing, which said something about how focused he was on the horse. "Came to us 4 months ago from an animal rescue operation in Texas. They pulled him from an illegal rodeo outfit that used horses for bucking competitions. Not the legal kind. The kind where they use cattle prods and spiked spurs and don't much care if the animal lives or dies, long as it puts on a show first." Jim didn't take his eyes off the horse. What happened to him? "Everything bad that can happen to a horse." Maggie's voice carried weight that suggested she wasn't exaggerating. "Beatings, starvation, electric shocks. They blinded his right eye with a steel rod when he was 5. That was 8 years ago. He's been in fight or flight mode ever since. Mostly fight." "Why isn't he put down?" "Because I don't kill things for being broken by humans." Jim glanced at her. Maggie stared at Phantom with an expression that might have been love or might have been stubbornness or might have been both. 3 weeks ago he was scheduled for euthanasia at the rescue facility, Maggie continued. "Too dangerous," they said. "Unsalvageable. I drove 9 hours to see him before they did it. Looked in his eye and saw something they didn't, so I brought him here." "What did you see?" "A soldier who'd been at war too long and forgotten there was anything else." The words hit Jim in the chest. He looked back at Phantom. The horse hadn't moved, hadn't looked away. The standoff continued, silent and electric. "He's hurt 3 people in 4 months, Maggie said. "Ben was the latest. Boy's got good instincts with horses, but Phantom doesn't trust men. Doesn't trust anyone really, but especially not men. Can't say I blame him. What's his timeline? Maggie didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter. 30 days. Vet's coming next week to evaluate. If he hasn't shown improvement, if he's still a danger, then. She didn't finish. Jim nodded. He understood unfinished sentences. His whole life was full of them. Come on, Maggie said. Let Ben get patched up and we'll have that dinner conversation. Jim didn't move. He was still watching Phantom, and Phantom was still watching him. The horse's breathing had slowed slightly. The tension in its body remained, coiled and ready, but something had shifted. Jim couldn't name it, but he felt it. In a minute, Jim said. Maggie looked at him, then at the horse, then back at Jim. Don't go in that paddock. I won't. I mean it, Jim. That horse will kill you. I know. Maggie hesitated, then walked back toward the house, leaving Jim alone with Phantom and the fading light. Jim stood there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. Time did that thing it did sometimes, where it stopped being measurable and just became the space between heartbeats. The temperature dropped. His breath made clouds. His feet went numb in his boots. He didn't move. Phantom didn't move either. They stood like that, man and horse, two damaged things taking measure of each other across 20 feet of frozen ground and split rail fence. Finally, Jim spoke. His voice was quiet, barely louder than the wind. I see you, he said. Phantom's ear flicked forward. Just one ear, just a fraction of movement, but it was something. I know what it's like, Jim continued, still quiet, still calm. Waiting for the next hit, waiting for the pain, waiting for someone to prove you right about how bad the world is. The horse's breathing changed, slowed another degree. I know what it's like to forget there was ever anything else, Jim said. To forget what safe feels like. To forget that not everything is a threat. Phantom took a single step forward, just one, then stopped. Jim's pulse quickened, but his body stayed loose, arms at his sides, posture open. Every instinct from 15 years of working with military dogs told him, don't challenge, don't crowd, just be present. You and me, Jim said. We've been fighting so long we forgot what we're fighting for, forgot what we're fighting against, just kept fighting because that's all we knew how to do. Another step. Phantom was now 15 feet from the fence, close enough that Jim could see the details. The network of scars, the way the muscles bunched under the skin ready to explode into violence, the white around the good eye, the way the bad eye still tried to track movement even though it couldn't see. But I'm tired, Jim said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the word. I'm so goddamn tired of fighting, tired of being scared, tired of being angry, tired of waking up every day waiting for it to get worse. Phantom was at the fence now, 10 feet away, breathing hard but not charging, not rearing, just standing there with his head high and his eye locked on Jim's face. I don't know if we can get better, Jim said. I don't know if there's a better for things like us, but I know I can't do worse than I've already done, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we get. The horse lowered his head just an inch, just enough that Jim saw it. Yeah, Jim whispered, me too. The door of the main house opened. Light spilled out, yellow and warm. Maggie's voice called across the yard, Jim, dinner. Phantom's head snapped up. The ears went back. The body tensed, ready to bolt or fight or both. Jim took a slow step backward, hands still loose, still open. It's okay, he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. I'll come back. I'll come back tomorrow. He took another step back, then another, not turning his back, not moving quickly, just creating distance the way you'd retreat from a loaded weapon. Phantom watched him go. When Jim was 30 feet away, the horse snorted once, hard, then turned and trotted to the far corner of the paddock, as far from the house and the lights and the people as the fence allowed. Jim walked to the house on legs that felt disconnected from his body. His pulse was racing, adrenaline flooding his system the way it used to before combat operations. Something had happened out there. Something had shifted. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it mattered. The house was warm and smelled like pot roast and coffee. The kitchen was big and old-fashioned, with a wood table that could seat 10 and currently sat 5. Maggie was at the stove. The young man from the paddock, Ben, sat with his arm freshly bandaged, color back in his face. A woman in her 30s with dark hair and the careful eyes of someone who'd seen trauma stood by the sink, and an older man, maybe 75, sat in the corner with a cup of coffee and the posture of someone who'd been a soldier once and never quite stopped. "Everyone," Maggie said, "this is Jim Lattimer. He's going to be working with us. Jim, this is Ben Henson, my grandson, Sarah Connor, our vet, and Walt Kowalski, who helps out when his arthritis lets him." Jim nodded to each of them. Ben managed a weak smile. Sarah assessed him with the same careful eyes she probably used on sick animals. Walt raised his coffee cup in a small salute that Jim recognized. One veteran to another, no words needed. "Sit," Maggie said, pointing to an empty chair. "Eat, then we'll talk about what you saw out there." Jim sat. The chair was solid and old. The table had names and dates carved into it going back decades. The food, when Maggie served it, was simple and good. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, carrots, bread that was still warm from the oven. Jim ate slowly, methodically, the way you eat when you've gone hungry enough times that food stops being pleasure and becomes fuel. The others talked around him, about the ranch, about horses, about a storm coming in tomorrow, about nothing important and everything important. Jim listened and said nothing. Finally, when the plates were clear and the coffee was poured, Maggie looked at him across the table. "You stood with Phantom for over an hour," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Ben couldn't get within 30 feet before he charged the fence. "I wasn't trying to get close." "What were you trying to do?" Jim thought about it. "Nothing, I was just there." Walt spoke for the first time, his voice rough like gravel in a can. Sometimes that's all they need, just someone willing to be there and not ask for anything. Jim looked at the old man. Walt looked back, and in his eyes Jim saw something he recognized. The 1,000-yard stare, the one that saw through you to things that happened 40, 50 years ago in jungles and deserts and places that only existed in nightmares now. "You were in country," Walt said. "It wasn't a question." "3 tours," Jim said. "Iraq twice, Afghanistan once." "I was in Vietnam, 69 to 71, 1st Cavalry." They nodded at each other the way old soldiers do, acknowledgement without elaboration. Some things didn't need to be said. "Phantom needs someone like you," Maggie said. "Someone who understands what he's been through, not intellectually, not from books or training, but in here." She tapped her chest over her heart. "I don't know anything about horses," Jim said. "You know about trust. You know about fear. You know about what happens when the world hurts you so bad you forget it was ever anything else. That's all you need to know." Jim looked down at his coffee. It was black and strong and probably terrible for his stomach, but it was hot and real and in his hands. "I'm not a therapist," he said. "I'm barely functional most days." "Which is why you're perfect for the job," Sarah said. She'd been quiet until now, watching Jim with those careful eyes. "Phantom doesn't need someone who has all the answers. He needs someone who's honest about not having them." "The vet's coming in 7 days," Maggie said. That gives you a week to see if you and Phantom can find some kind of understanding. No pressure, no expectations, just try. Jim wanted to say no. Wanted to say he was the wrong person, that he'd fail like he'd failed at everything else, that broken people couldn't fix broken animals because all they did was break each other worse. But when he looked up, Maggie was watching him with eyes that had buried a husband and a son, and still got up every morning to feed horses that tried to kill her. "Okay," Jim said, "I'll try." "Good," Maggie said. "Ben, show Jim where we keep the feed and equipment. Sarah, I need you to look at Daisy's leg again. Walt, you should head home before the storm hits." People moved with the efficiency of long practice. Jim followed Ben out into the cold, which had deepened in the last hour, the kind of cold that found every gap in your clothes and reminded you that winter in Wyoming was not a metaphor. Ben was taller than Jim, broader in the shoulders, with the easy strength of someone who'd worked physically all his life. The bandage on his arm was already spotted with blood, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "Phantom got you good," Jim said as they walked to the barn. "Third time this month," Ben said. "First time he actually connected. Usually I'm faster." "Why do you keep trying?" Ben was quiet for a moment, breath steaming in the light spilling from the barn. "Because my aunt, Maggie's daughter-in-law, she died when I was 16. Car accident. Random. Stupid. I was angry for years. Started drinking, fighting, messing up everything I touched. Lost my marriage. Lost custody of my daughter. Lost my job. Came here 6 months ago because I had nowhere else to go, and Maggie said I could work for room and board while I figured my life out." They reached the barn. Ben pulled open the heavy sliding door. Inside, it smelled like hay and leather and horses and decades of accumulated history. "The horses here," Ben continued, "they've all been where I've been, hurt by things they didn't deserve, angry at a world that didn't make sense, dangerous because being dangerous was the only way to stay safe. And Maggie, she takes them in anyway, gives them time, gives them space, gives them a chance to remember they weren't always broken." He looked at Jim in the dim light of the barn. "I figure if she can do that for horses, maybe there's hope for people like us too." Jim didn't have an answer for that, so he just nodded and followed Ben deeper into the barn, learning where things lived. Feed bins, water buckets, medical supplies, tack, tools. It was organized with the precision of someone who'd been doing this for decades and couldn't afford mistakes. By the time they finished, snow had started falling, thick and heavy, the kind that would accumulate fast and turn roads impassable by morning. Ben headed back to the main house. Jim walked to the bunkhouse, each step crunching in the fresh snow. Inside, he built a fire in the wood stove, using kindling and technique he'd learned as a kid in Montana before the military took him away to see the world, and learned that the world was mostly pain. The fire caught, grew, filled the small space with warmth and the smell of burning pine. Jim sat on his bunk and pulled off his boots. His feet were numb. His fingers tingled as circulation returned, that pins and needles sensation that always came with warming up after exposure to cold. He flexed them, working feeling back into the joints. He thought about Phantom, standing in that paddock, body coiled with violence and fear. He thought about the moment their eyes had met and something had passed between them, some recognition that didn't need words. "I see you." Jim lay back on the bunk, still fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. The fire popped and crackled. Snow hit the windows in soft whispers. Somewhere in the distance, probably from Phantom's paddock, came the sound of a horse moving, hooves on frozen ground. For the first time in longer than Jim could remember, he felt something other than emptiness. Not hope. Hope was too big a word for men like him. But maybe possibility. Maybe the chance that tomorrow wouldn't be exactly like yesterday. Maybe that was enough. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the storm carry him down into something that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite waking, but was at least rest. And in that space between consciousness and dreams, he didn't see Baghdad or Fallujah or the faces of the men he'd lost. He saw a gray and white horse with one good eye, standing alone in the snow, waiting. Just waiting. For what, Jim didn't know yet. But he'd come back tomorrow and find out. That was the first promise he'd made to anyone, including himself, in 3 years. It would have to be enough. Outside, the storm settled in for the night, covering everything in white, hiding all the scars, making the world look clean and new and full of possibility, at least until morning when the sun would rise and reveal that nothing had really changed at all. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Jim Lattimer slept without screaming. And 30 yards away in a paddock at the edge of the property, a horse named Phantom stood in the falling snow and looked toward the bunkhouse where a light still burned, and for the first time in 8 years, didn't spend the whole night waiting for the next beating. Small mercies. The kind that might, given time and patience and the fragile mathematics of broken things finding each other, add up to something bigger. Or they might not. But for tonight, on a ranch called Redemption Ridge in the middle of a Wyoming winter, 2 damaged souls had found each other across a fence and a lifetime of pain. And that was a start. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a world transformed. Jim woke at 500 hours, the old military habit hardwired so deep that his body didn't need an alarm. The bunkhouse was cold despite the embers still glowing in the wood stove. He dressed in layers, the same clothes he'd worn yesterday because they were the warmest things he owned, and stepped outside into air so crisp it felt like breathing broken glass. The ranch was silent in that particular way of early mornings after heavy snow, everything muffled and held close. The only sounds were his boots crunching and the distant call of a raven somewhere in the cottonwoods. Jim walked to Phantom's paddock before he went to the main house, before he did anything else, because that was the promise he'd made, and broken promises were something Jim Lattimer had lived with long enough. Phantom stood in the far corner, exactly where he'd been last night. Snow had accumulated on his back and head, turning the gray and white coat into something almost spectral. The horse didn't acknowledge Jim's approach, didn't turn, didn't react. Just stood there like a statue carved from old grief and newer snow. Jim stopped at the fence, the same spot as yesterday. He didn't speak this time. Words had been for introduction. Now was for presence, for showing up, for being the kind of reliable that Phantom had probably never experienced from a human before. They stood like that for 15 minutes. Jim's feet went numb. His hands buried deep in his jacket pockets went stiff. He didn't move. Neither did Phantom. Finally, Jim turned and walked to the main house, where light glowed in the kitchen windows, and the smell of coffee drifted out into the cold. Maggie was already up, standing at the stove frying eggs and bacon, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this since before Jim was born. She glanced at him as he entered, kicked the snow off his boots, hung his jacket on a peg by the door. "You want to see him first," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Coffee's fresh. Pour yourself a cup." Jim did. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint and exactly what he needed. He stood by the window, looking out at the white expanse of the ranch, the paddocks and barns and outbuildings half buried in snow. In the distance, Phantom was a gray shadow against white. "He didn't move when you were there," Maggie said. "No, ma'am." "But he didn't charge either." "No, ma'am." Maggie cracked another egg into the pan. That's progress, small but it counts. Ben came in a few minutes later, followed by Sarah. They ate breakfast in a comfortable silence, the kind that happens when people work together long enough that everything important has already been said. After, Maggie laid out the day's work. Fences needed checking after the storm, the barn roof had a leak that needed patching before the next snow, the other horses needed feeding and care, and someone had to drive into town for supplies. Jim, Maggie said, you're on phantom duty. Morning and evening, rest of the day help Ben with whatever needs doing. What's phantom duty? Jim asked. Sit with him, don't try to touch him, don't try to get in the paddock, just be there. Let him get used to you being part of the landscape. It sounded simple. Jim knew better, nothing was ever simple. He spent the morning learning the ranch. Ben showed him the other horses, each with their own story of damage and survival. There was Daisy, an Appaloosa mare who'd been starved nearly to death by owners who forgot they'd bought her. She was skittish around food, would eat too fast and make herself sick if you didn't portion it out carefully. There was Duke, a quarter-horse gelding who'd been used in illegal racing and beaten when he didn't win. He had scars on his legs from whips and an attitude that said trust was for suckers. There was a 3-year-old Mustang filly named Sage who'd been rescued from a hoarding situation. 30 horses on 2 acres, standing in their own waste, half of them dead before authorities intervened. Each horse carried their history in their bodies, in their behaviors, in the way they looked at humans with variations of the same expression. Prove you're different. Jim understood that look. He saw it in his own mirror when he could bear to look. By noon, he was back at Phantom's paddock. The horse had moved to a different corner but still kept maximum distance. Jim sat on an overturned feed bucket on the outside of the fence and just existed. He didn't read, didn't use his phone, which was dead anyway and he hadn't bothered to charge. He just sat and breathed and let his mind do what it did. Drift through memories he couldn't control, flash to Baghdad and Fallujah, and the sounds of explosions that weren't happening except they were always happening in the part of his brain that never left the war. At some point he realized Phantom was looking at him. Not constantly, but in glances, quick assessments. The horse would face away, then turn his head just enough that the good eye could track Jim's position. Checking, making sure the threat hadn't moved closer, making sure it was still just sitting there doing nothing. Jim did nothing for 2 hours. When he stood up to help Ben with the barn roof, his legs had gone stiff and his back complained in ways that reminded him he wasn't 30 anymore. But as he walked away, he felt it, the weight of being watched. He turned at the barn door and looked back. Phantom stood at the fence, as close as he'd been last night, watching Jim leave. Progress. Small and fragile and maybe meaningless. But progress. The days fell into a pattern: wake before dawn, visit Phantom, breakfast, work the ranch, sit with Phantom at midday, work more, sit with Phantom at evening, dinner, sleep, repeat. By day 3, Phantom no longer retreated to the far corner when Jim approached. He'd stay wherever he was, watching, assessing, but not running. By day 5, Jim brought an apple. He set it on the fence post and walked away without looking back. The next morning, the apple was gone. By day 6, the vet arrived. Her name was Dr. Rachel Morrison, and she drove up in a white truck with Morrison Equine Services painted on the side. She was younger than Jim expected, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of competence that came from years of schooling and practice. She unpacked her equipment with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Stethoscope, ophthalmoscope, syringes, vials, a tablet computer for notes. Maggie met her in the yard. Jim watched from near the barn, where he and Ben were replacing rotted boards. "He hasn't improved," he heard Maggie say. Has he gotten worse? Rachel's voice was professional neutral. No, but he hasn't gotten better. Still won't let anyone touch him. Still charges if you get too close too fast. Rachel nodded, making notes on her tablet. I'll need to examine him. At minimum, check vitals from a distance, assess body condition, look at those old injuries. If possible, I'd like to do blood work, but I'm not optimistic. They walked toward Phantom's paddock. Jim set down his hammer and followed at a distance. Something in his chest felt tight, like the minutes before a mission went live, when you knew the shooting would start but you didn't know from where. Phantom saw them coming. His head went up, ears back, body tensing into that familiar coil of potential violence. Rachel stopped 20 feet from the fence. She stood very still, just observing. Jim could see her taking in the details, the scars, the blind eye, the way Phantom's weight was slightly off on the left rear leg, favoring an old injury, the way every muscle was ready to explode. Jesus, Rachel said quietly. Yeah, Maggie said. Who did this to him? We don't know. The rescue organization that pulled him didn't have much history. Just that he came from a rodeo operation in Texas that got raided by authorities. The owner disappeared before charges could be filed. Rachel moved closer, slowly, one hand extended in a gesture that was supposed to be calming. Phantom's ears went flat against his head. A sound came from him, not quite a scream but a warning. The horse reared up, front hooves pawing the air, then crashed down and charged the fence. Rachel stumbled backward. Maggie caught her arm, steadying her. That's what I meant by not improved, Maggie said. Jim found himself moving without deciding to move, walking toward the paddock. Rachel saw him coming, started to say something, probably a warning, but Maggie held up a hand. Jim stopped at the fence, the same spot he'd stood every day for a week. Phantom was at the far end now, sides heaving, eye wild. Jim didn't reach out, didn't speak, just stood there. And slowly, over the space of 5 minutes that felt like an hour, Phantom's breathing settled. The tension in his body didn't disappear, but it lessened. He stopped looking like he was about to attack and started looking like he was about to run. Fear, Jim thought, not anger, always fear. Rachel approached carefully, coming to stand next to Jim. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the horse, watching Jim. How long have you been working with him? She asked. 6 days. Has he let you touch him? No. Has he charged you? No. Rachel pulled out her tablet, made notes. This is unusual. Horses this traumatized don't typically show selective trust. They're either shut down completely or reactive to everyone. Maybe he recognizes something, Maggie said. Like what? Maggie looked at Jim, someone who's been hurt the same way. Rachel's eyes shifted to Jim, reassessing. He could feel her reading him the way she'd read the horse, noting the tension in his shoulders, the scars on his knuckles, the way his hands had a fine tremor, the fact that he stood with his weight balanced like someone expecting contact. The thousand small tells that said veteran, said trauma, said broken, but still standing. I can't do a full exam like this, Rachel said. I can observe from outside the fence, but anything invasive, anything that requires touch, isn't going to happen. So what's your recommendation? Maggie asked, and Jim heard what she wasn't saying. Tell me you're not going to say we should put him down. Rachel was quiet for a long time. Give it another 30 days. Let this continue. She gestured at Jim and Phantom. Whatever's happening here, it's something. Maybe not enough, but it's more than I've seen in cases this severe. And after 30 days, we'll reassess. But Maggie, you need to be realistic. If he can't be touched, can't be examined, can't be treated for medical issues, then we're talking about quality of life. An animal that lives in constant fear isn't living. It's just surviving. And surviving isn't always enough. Maggie's jaw tightened, but she nodded. 30 days. Rachel spent another hour observing the other horses, checking on Daisy's weight gain, examining Duke's legs, giving Sage her vaccinations. Jim went back to work on the barn, but his mind stayed with Phantom and the counting clock. 30 days. That evening after dinner, Jim sat at Phantom's fence in the twilight. The sky was deep blue fading to black, stars beginning to emerge in that way they did out here, away from cities, brilliant and cold and infinite. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down. Jim's breath made clouds. He talked to Phantom for the first time since that first day. 30 days, he said quietly. That's what they gave us. 1 month to prove we're not hopeless cases. Phantom stood 20 feet away, a gray shadow in the gathering dark. I don't know if that's enough time, Jim continued. Hell, I don't know if there's enough time in the world for things like us, but it's what we've got. The horse shifted weight, the sound of hooves on frozen ground. I killed 4 men once, Jim said, the words coming from somewhere he usually kept locked down. Good men, young men, men who trusted me to make the right call, and I made the wrong one. Sent them into a building in Ramadi that I thought was clear. It wasn't clear. It was rigged to blow. They died because I failed them. The night was quiet, except for wind in the bare branches. I've been carrying that for 12 years, Jim said. 12 years of waking up and knowing I'm alive because they're dead. 12 years of wondering why I got to survive when they didn't. I left my family because I couldn't live with myself, and I couldn't ask them to live with what I'd become. I've been drifting ever since, waiting to die but too much of a coward to do it myself. Phantom took a step closer, then another. And then I came here and I saw you, Jim said, and I recognized you, not just your pain, but your fight, the way you're still standing even though everything in you wants to give up, the way you're still here even though here is just another kind of hell. The horse was 10 feet away now, closer than he'd ever been by choice. I don't know if I can save you, Jim whispered. I can't even save myself, but maybe we don't need saving. Maybe we just need someone to stand with us while we figure out how to stop fighting ourselves. Phantom stood at the fence now, head high, eye locked on Jim's face. This close, Jim could see every scar, every old wound, every piece of damage that humans had inflicted on an animal that never asked for any of it. Jim slowly stood up, Phantom tense but didn't retreat. Jim raised one hand, not reaching toward the horse, just lifting it so Phantom could see. Palm open. No weapon. No threat. I see you, Jim said, the same words from that first day. And I won't hurt you, I promise. It wasn't much of a promise. Jim had broken so many promises in his life that one more probably didn't matter. But he meant it, in this moment, standing in the Wyoming dark with a broken horse and his own broken pieces. Phantom watched him for another long moment. Then, in a movement so quick Jim almost missed it, the horse reached forward and touched his nose to Jim's extended hand. Just a touch, barely contact, then immediately pulled back. But it happened. Jim's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there with his hand still raised like he was swearing an oath. Yeah, he breathed. Yeah, okay, that's good, that's real good. Phantom snorted once, then turned and walked to the far corner of his paddock, done with humans for the night. Jim stood there shaking, from cold and adrenaline and something else he couldn't name. He walked back to the bunkhouse in a daze, built up the fire, lay on his bunk fully dressed. He'd felt Phantom's breath on his hand, the warmth of it, the realness. For the first time in 12 years, Jim Lattimer felt something other than numbness. He felt connected. The next morning, everything changed. Jim woke to the sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, expensive vehicles, the kind with engines that purred instead of rumbled. He looked out the bunkhouse window and saw 3 black SUVs parked in the ranch yard, pristine and out of place among the work trucks and tractors and honest dirt. Men in suits stood near the vehicles. Not ranch suits, not Western wear, East Coast suits. The kind that cost more than Jim made in 6 months back when he had regular employment. And standing at the center of them, talking to Maggie on the porch of the main house, was a man who looked like he owned everything he touched. Thomas Crane was 61 years old but carried it well. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut military short, and a face that had probably been handsome before it settled into the hard lines of someone used to power. He wore slacks and a cashmere coat that probably cost $5,000. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine despite the snow and mud. Jim dressed quickly and headed for the house. Ben was already there, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, radiating distrust. Sarah stood near the barn, watching. Walt had appeared from somewhere, leaning on his cane, face unreadable. As Jim approached, he heard Crane's voice. Smooth, educated, the kind of voice used to boardrooms and command. "Mrs. Henson, I appreciate you taking my call. I know this is irregular." "You said it was urgent." Maggie's voice was flat, giving nothing. "It is. I've been tracking one of my horses for over a year. Stolen from my ranch in Texas during an illegal raid by so-called animal rights activists. I have reason to believe he's here." Jim felt his gut tighten. He knew before Crane said it. "His registered name is Storm Shadow," Crane continued. "Gray and white Mustang, approximately 12 years old, 17 hands, distinctive scarring, blind in the right eye." Maggie's expression didn't change. "What makes you think I have your horse?" "I have people who track these things. Your ranch took in a horse matching that description 4 months ago from a rescue operation in Colorado. That rescue operation acquired him from a facility in Texas that was," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "shut down under controversial circumstances." "By controversial, you mean your illegal rodeo operation was raided for animal abuse?" Crane's smile didn't waver, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "I was never charged with anything, Mrs. Henson. No evidence of wrongdoing was ever established. What was established was that valuable animals were stolen from a legitimate business by extremists operating outside the law. If the business was legitimate, why were 12 horses found dead on the property?" "Tragic accidents during training. The rodeo business is inherently dangerous. Animals get hurt. We did everything by the book." "The book," Maggie said, "must have some interesting chapters." One of Crane's lawyers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, stepped forward with a briefcase. "Mrs. Henson, we have documentation, registration papers, bill of sale, veterinary records from before the theft, everything proving Mr. Crane's ownership of the animal in question." He handed over a folder. Maggie took it, flipped through the pages. Jim watched her face, saw the moment she realized the papers were legitimate, or at least professional enough to pass legal scrutiny. "I want to see the horse," Crane said. "Why?" Maggie asked. "If you have all this documentation, why not just file a civil suit and let the courts sort it out?" "Because I'm trying to be reasonable. If it's not my horse, I'll apologize for the intrusion and be on my way. If it is, perhaps we can come to an arrangement that doesn't involve lawyers and judges." Maggie looked at Jim. He could see the question in her eyes. "What do you think?" Jim looked at Crane. really looked at him, took in the expensive clothes, the confident posture, the smile that never reached his eyes, took in the way the man stood like someone who'd never been told no in his life and wouldn't accept it if he was. And Jim saw something else, something familiar, the bearing, the haircut, the way Crane held himself. Military had to be. "What branch?" Jim asked. Crane's attention shifted to him for the first time. "I'm sorry." "What branch did you serve in?" The smile froze for just a second. "Army, infantry, Vietnam, 69 to 71, and you are?" "Nobody important." "He's my ranch hand," Maggie said, "and he's right to ask. You carry yourself like a soldier. So did my husband. So did my son. They both died from what the war did to them. Makes me cautious around men who came back from the same wars and ended up rich instead of dead." Crane's expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "I'm sorry for your losses, but my service and my subsequent success are hardly relevant to the matter at hand." Everything's relevant when you're asking to take an animal that's been tortured. Allegedly tortured by unknown persons during a period when he was stolen from me. The conversation was heading somewhere bad. Jim could feel it, the way you felt incoming fire before it arrived. He stepped forward. "I'll take him to see Phantom," Jim said to Maggie. "Jim, you don't have to." "It's fine." Jim looked at Crane. "Just you. Your lawyers stay here." Crane studied Jim for a long moment, then nodded. "Agreed." They walked toward the paddocks, boots crunching in snow that was starting to freeze into crust as the morning cold deepened. Phantom's paddock was on the far side, away from the other horses. Isolated. Alone. "You work here long?" Crane asked conversationally. "Week and a half." "Must be quite a change from military life." Jim didn't answer. They reached the paddock. Phantom stood in the center, already alert, already tense. The horse's good eye locked onto them, but mostly onto Crane, and something happened that Jim had never seen before. Phantom started to scream. Not the warning sound from when Rachel had approached, not the defiant charge. This was pure terror given voice, a sound that came from the deep animal brain where fear lived before language existed to name it. The horse reared up, came down, reared again. Started running along the fence line, faster and faster, slamming his body against the rails hard enough that wood cracked. Blood appeared on his shoulder where old wounds reopened. "Phantom!" Jim shouted, moving toward the fence. "Don't!" Crane's hand caught Jim's arm, strong grip, the kind that came from a lifetime of physical work despite the fancy clothes. "You'll make it worse." Jim shook off the grip and climbed halfway over the fence. "Phantom, easy, easy." But the horse wasn't listening. The horse was gone, lost in whatever hell Crane's presence had triggered. Phantom crashed into the fence again, and this time the top rail splintered. The horse's legs tangled in the broken wood. He went down hard. Jim was over the fence and running before thought caught up to instinct. Stupid. Dangerous. Everything Maggie had warned against. But Phantom was down and bleeding and making sounds no animal should make. "Stay back," Ben's voice running from the barn. Sarah right behind him. Jim reached Phantom and dropped to his knees in the snow. The horse's eye rolled white with panic. Blood ran from cuts on his legs and shoulder. But he wasn't fighting Jim. He was fighting the fence, fighting the memories, fighting everything that Crane represented. Jim put his hands on Phantom's neck. Felt the hammering heartbeat, the overheated skin, the trembling of every muscle. "It's okay," Jim said, knowing it wasn't. "I'm here, you're safe, he can't hurt you." Phantom's breathing was too fast, too shallow. Shock, Jim realized. The horse was going into shock. Sarah arrived with a medical bag. "Jim, you need to move back so I can." "No," Jim's voice was flat. "He needs me here. He needs to know someone's staying." Sarah looked at Maggie, who'd arrived with Ben. Maggie nodded. Sarah knelt on the other side of Phantom, began checking vitals, assessing damage. Jim kept his hands on Phantom's neck, kept his voice low and steady, kept repeating the same useless promises that horses probably couldn't understand but maybe, just maybe, could feel. Behind them at the fence, Thomas Crane stood watching, and on his face, just for a moment before he smoothed it away, was an expression that Jim recognized from 100 firefights and 1,000 moments of violence. Not surprise, not concern. Recognition. The look of a man seeing something he'd created. Sarah administered a sedative. Phantom's breathing gradually slowed. The wild panic in his eye faded to exhausted fear. With Ben and Jim helping, they managed to get the horse untangled from the broken fence and back on his feet. He stood shaking, favoring the left front leg now, blood matting his coat. "He needs stitches," Sarah said. "That shoulder wound reopened bad, and I need to x-ray that leg to make sure nothing's broken." "Can you do it here?" Maggie asked. "I'll have to. Moving him right now would be cruel." They set up a makeshift treatment area in the paddock. Sarah worked with the calm efficiency of someone who'd patched up animals in worse conditions. Jim stayed at Phantom's head, hands never leaving contact with the horse's neck, feeling every twitch and tremor. Crane watched it all from outside the fence. When Sarah finally stepped back, wound stitched and bandaged, leg x-rayed and determined to be bruised but not broken, he spoke. "That's him," Crane said. "That's Storm Shadow. I'd know him anywhere." "Your horse," Maggie said carefully, "is afraid of you." Horses are afraid of lots of things. Doesn't prove anything except he was traumatized during the period he was stolen. He wasn't afraid until he saw you. Crane's expression hardened. "I'm not responsible for what happened to him while criminals had possession of my property. But he is my property, Mrs. Henson, legally, documented, and I want him back." "He's not property," Jim said quietly, still kneeling beside Phantom. "He's a living thing that's been through hell. A living thing I own, and I have the papers to prove it." "Papers don't mean shit when—" "Jim," Maggie's voice cut through, "not now." Jim looked up at her, saw the defeat in her eyes. She'd read those documents. She knew Crane was right, at least legally. Crane pulled out his phone, made a call. "Yes, file the motion today. I want a court order for property return by end of week." He hung up, looked at Maggie. "I didn't want it to come to this. I offered to be reasonable. Now my lawyers will handle it." "Why?" Maggie asked. "Why do you even want him? He's damaged, dangerous. What possible use is he to you?" For the first time, Crane's mask slipped. Something raw showed through, just for a moment. "That horse was special to someone I loved," he said quietly. "Someone I lost. Getting him back isn't about use. It's about making things right." Then the mask was back, smooth and impenetrable. "You'll be served papers within 48 hours, Crane said. "I suggest you get your own lawyer. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Henson, I have resources you can't match. This will end with me getting my horse back. The only question is how much it costs you to delay the inevitable." He turned and walked back toward his SUVs, expensive shoes leaving perfect prints in the snow. Jim watched him go, still kneeling beside Phantom, still feeling the horse's heartbeat under his hands, and thought, no. Just no. He didn't know what no meant yet. Didn't know what he could do or would do or should do. But he knew with absolute certainty that Thomas Crane was lying. About something, about everything, about the kind of man who saw a terrified animal and felt nothing. Jim had known men like that in the war, men who'd lost the part of themselves that made them human and replaced it with something cold and calculating and capable of anything. He'd seen what those men did when nobody was watching, and he'd be damned if he'd let one of them take Phantom. The SUVs drove away, leaving tracks in the snow that would freeze and last for days. The ranch felt smaller after they left, quieter, like something had been taken that couldn't be put back. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow orange and red like fire and blood, Jim sat with Phantom in the paddock. The horse was calmer now, the sedative wearing off, but exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. The kind of exhaustion that came from being forced to relive your worst memories. "I know him," Jim said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but that man hurt you, and he's going to try to take you back, and I won't let that happen." Phantom stood close enough that Jim could touch him if he reached out. Jim didn't reach, just sat there in the cold as stars appeared overhead and the temperature dropped toward zero. Inside the main house, Maggie was on the phone with lawyers. Ben was researching property laws. Sarah was documenting every injury on Phantom, building a case for abuse. And somewhere in Texas, Thomas Crane was making his own calls, mobilizing his own resources, putting into motion whatever plan would get him back the horse he claimed to own. The war had started. Jim just hoped they had enough time to figure out how to fight it before the battle was already lost. He stayed with Phantom until full dark, until Maggie called him in for dinner, until his hands were numb and his feet were blocks of ice. And when he finally stood to leave, Phantom followed him to the fence and watched him walk away. Progress, Jim thought. But the word felt hollow now. Because what good was progress when the clock was counting down, and the enemy had already won before the first shot was even fired? The legal papers arrived by courier on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a young man in a uniform who looked apologetic as he handed Maggie the envelope. She signed for it without speaking, closed the door, and sat at the kitchen table to read what she already knew would break her heart. Jim watched from the doorway. He'd been up since 4, couldn't sleep, spent the hours before dawn sitting with Phantom in the dark. The horse was healing physically. The stitches in his shoulder were holding. The bruised leg was improving. But something had broken in Phantom that night when Crane appeared, some fragile trust that Jim had been building piece by piece. The horse was afraid again. Not of Jim, not exactly, but of everything, of the future, of what was coming. Jim understood. He felt the same way. Maggie read the papers twice, then pushed them across the table. "You should see this." Jim sat down, pulled the documents closer. Legalese filled the pages, dense and impenetrable, but the core message was clear enough. Thomas Crane was filing suit for immediate return of property, specifically one horse registered as Storm Shadow. Preliminary hearing scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Respondent, Margaret Henson, required to appear and show cause why said property should not be returned to rightful owner. Attached were documents Jim had seen before: registration papers, bills of sale, veterinary records from 2019 showing a horse matching Phantom's description under Crane's ownership. Everything clean, everything legal, everything impossible to fight. "We need a lawyer," Jim said. "Already called one. David Ortiz. He's a friend from the VFW, does pro bono work for veterans. He's coming tomorrow to review the case." "Can he win?" Maggie's laugh was bitter. "Win? Against Thomas Crane? Jim, the man has more money than this ranch is worth 20 times over. He's got lawyers who specialize in making problems disappear. And he's got the law on his side. Those papers are legitimate. I had Sarah verify them. Crane owned a horse matching Phantom's description. That horse was reported stolen when animal control raided his facility. Everything he's claiming is technically true, except the part where he tortured that horse for 8 years, which we can't prove. We can document current injuries, but we can't tie them to Crane. He'll claim the damage happened while Phantom was in the hands of the rescue organization, or here, or anywhere else. Without witnesses, without evidence from before the raid, we've got nothing. Jim stood up, paced to the window. Outside, Ben was working on the fence repair in Phantom's paddock. Sarah was in the barn with the other horses. Walt hadn't arrived yet. Everything looked normal, like the world wasn't falling apart in slow motion. "There has to be something," Jim said. "People who worked for him, records, something." "You think we haven't looked?" That rescue organization that pulled Phantom, they tried to build a case against Crane for 2 years. Couldn't make it stick. Every employee who might have testified either disappeared, recanted their statements, or ended up with mysterious payoffs. The man knows how to bury evidence. Jim turned from the window. "What about the other horses, the ones that died?" "Ruled accidental, training mishaps. The coroner's reports all said natural causes or accidental death. Not one was ruled suspicious. 12 horses don't die by accident." "They do when you have the money to make sure that's what the paperwork says." The hopelessness in Maggie's voice hit Jim harder than the legal documents. He'd heard that tone before, in the voices of soldiers who knew the mission was already lost, but had to keep fighting anyway because that's what soldiers did. The front door opened. Ben came in, stomping snow off his boots. "Fence is patched. Should hold until we can do a proper replacement in spring." "Thanks, Ben." Maggie gathered the legal papers, slid them back into the envelope like she could contain the problem by containing the documents. "You should know. Crane's lawyers are demanding return of the horse within 30 days. If we fight and lose, we'll be liable for boarding costs and legal fees." Ben's face hardened. "How much?" "More than we have, more than the ranch is worth. So we're just going to give up, hand Phantom over to the man who destroyed him." "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying?" Maggie looked old suddenly, older than her 68 years, tired in a way that went beyond lack of sleep. "I'm saying we fight. I'm saying we find a way to prove what that man did. I'm saying we don't give up. But I'm also saying we need to be realistic about our chances." Jim left them talking strategy and walked out to Phantom's paddock. The horse stood in the corner that had become his preferred spot, the one that gave him sight lines to all approaches. His head came up when Jim appeared, ears forward, the good eye tracking movement. Jim climbed over the newly repaired fence and dropped into the paddock. Stupid, maybe. Dangerous, definitely. But he'd been in the paddock every day since the incident with Crane, and Phantom had allowed it. More than allowed it. The horse seemed to need it, needed the presence of someone who wasn't going to hurt him. "Hey boy," Jim said quietly, moving slow, keeping his body language open and non-threatening. "How's the leg?" Phantom nickered softly, a sound Jim had learned meant acknowledgement without commitment. The horse didn't approach, but he didn't retreat either. They existed in the space between, the distance that felt safe for both of them. Jim sat down in the snow, back against a fence post, and just breathed. The cold seeped through his jeans. His breath made clouds. Somewhere a crow called, harsh and mocking. "They're going to try to take you," Jim said. "That man, Crane, he's got lawyers and money and the law on his side. And we've got nothing except the truth, and the truth doesn't seem to matter much when you're going against someone with power." Phantom moved closer, one slow step at a time, the way he'd been doing more and more lately. Close enough now that Jim could see every scar, every old wound, every piece of damage that humans had inflicted on an animal that never asked for any of it. "I won't let him take you," Jim said. "I don't know how I'm going to stop it. Don't know what I can do that matters, but I promise you I won't stop fighting." The horse lowered his head, brought his nose close to Jim's face. Breath warm against cold skin. Jim held perfectly still, hardly breathing, as Phantom investigated him with the careful attention of someone who'd been betrayed too many times to trust easily. Then Phantom did something he'd never done before. He rested his head on Jim's shoulder, the weight of it solid and real and heartbreaking. Jim's hand came up slowly, carefully, and touched Phantom's neck. The horse tensed but didn't pull away. Jim's fingers found the coarse hair of the mane, felt the warmth of living muscle underneath, felt the tremor that never quite went away. "Yeah," Jim whispered, "I've got you." They stayed like that for a long time, man and horse, holding each other up in a world that wanted to break them both. The lawyer arrived the next morning in a beat-up Toyota that had seen better decades. David Ortiz was 58, built like someone who'd spent his youth in hard labor and his middle age behind a desk. He wore jeans, a flannel shirt, and a blazer that had probably been nice in 1995. Former Marine, Maggie had said, two-tour in Desert Storm. Now he did legal aid for veterans and lost causes. "Mrs. Henson," he shook Maggie's hand, then nodded to Jim and Ben. "I've reviewed the documents you sent. I'm not going to lie to you. This is bad." They sat around the kitchen table, coffee steaming in mismatched mugs. Ortiz spread out papers, creating zones of information. "Crane's ownership claim is solid," Ortiz said. "Registration, bill of sale, vet records, all dated before the animal control raid, all properly notarized and filed. In the eyes of the law, he owned this horse." "Owns," Ben corrected, present tense, because we're not conceding anything. "Right, owns. The question is whether we can establish grounds to nullify that ownership. Animal cruelty laws in Wyoming allow for seizure of animals from abusive situations, but that requires proof of abuse while the animal was in the owner's care." "Phantom scars," Sarah said. She joined them, bringing medical files. "The injuries are consistent with long-term abuse. Electric prod burns, whip scars, evidence of sustained malnutrition at some point in his history." "Can you testify to when those injuries occurred?" Sarah hesitated. "No, I can testify to their existence and approximate age, but I can't definitively say they happened while Crane owned him versus after the horse was seized." Which is exactly what Crane's lawyers will argue. They'll claim the abuse happened during the period the horse was stolen. They'll paint the rescue organization as radical activists who mistreated the animal and are now trying to cover their tracks. "That's insane," Ben said. "That's expensive legal representation. They don't need truth, they just need reasonable doubt." Ortiz pulled out another document. "I did some digging into Crane's background. The man's got a history, but it's buried deep. He served in Vietnam, came back with commendations, went into business. Made his first million in real estate in the 80s, expanded into ranching, horse breeding, rodeo stock contracting. On paper, he's a model citizen. Donations to veterans organizations, serves on charity boards, the whole package." "And off paper?" Jim asked. Ortiz looked at him, and something passed between them, that recognition again. Two men who knew the difference between official reports and actual truth. "Off paper, there are whispers. 3 animal cruelty investigations in 20 years, none of them resulting in charges. 7 wrongful death lawsuits from employees or their families, all settled out of court with NDAs. A pattern of people who work for him either getting rich or disappearing." "So he's good at covering his tracks," Maggie said. "He's excellent at it. which means we need to be better at uncovering them. Ortiz leaned forward. We have 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing. In that time, we need to find someone who worked for Crane and is willing to testify. We need documentation of abuse that predates the raid. We need something concrete that ties him directly to Phantom's injuries. And if we can't find that, Ben asked, then we lose. The horse goes back to Crane, and there's nothing we can do about it. Silence filled the kitchen. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Inside, the weight of impossible odds pressed down on everyone. I'll find something, Jim said. Everyone looked at him. I'll find proof, people who worked for him, records, whatever it takes. Jim, Ortiz said carefully, I appreciate the determination, but Crane's been dodging investigations for 2 decades. If professional investigators couldn't find dirt on him, what makes you think you can? Because I'm not a professional investigator. I'm just a man with nothing left to lose and a promise to keep. That afternoon, Jim started making calls. He used Maggie's landline because his cell phone was still dead and he still hadn't bothered charging it. He called every animal rescue organization in Texas, Colorado, and Wyoming. He called rodeo associations, stock contractors, training facilities. He asked about Thomas Crane and learned very quickly that the man's name created silence. Sorry, can't help you. We don't discuss former clients. I'd love to help, but I've got nothing to say. You should talk to a lawyer. Click dial tone, the sound of doors closing. By evening, Jim had made 37 calls and learned nothing, except that Thomas Crane was very good at making sure people stayed quiet. Ben had more luck with internet research. He set up his laptop at the kitchen table and dug into public records, court filings, business registrations. What he found was a corporate shell game. Crane owned dozens of LLCs, each one layered behind another, creating a maze of ownership that made tracking his actual business operations nearly impossible. High Plains Performance Horses, that's the one Phantom came from, Ben said, pulling up documents. But it's owned by Crane Enterprises LLC, which is owned by Lone Star Holdings, which is owned by a trust based in Delaware. Every layer adds legal complexity and makes it harder to connect Crane directly to anything that happened at that facility. Smart, Jim said. Criminal, Ben corrected. This is how you hide illegal activity. You bury it in so many corporate layers that by the time anyone untangles it, the evidence is gone and the witnesses are scared or bought off. Walt spoke up from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly, listening. The old man had been at the ranch all day, helping with small tasks, but mostly just being present in the way old soldiers were when they sensed a battle coming. There's always someone who didn't get bought off, Walt said. Always someone who's angry enough or broke enough or guilty enough to talk. You just have to find them. How, Ben asked. You look for the ones who left. The ones who quit instead of staying quiet. The ones who walked away from money because they couldn't live with what they saw. Jim looked at Walt. You know someone like that? Walt was quiet for a long moment. Maybe, maybe not, but I know how to find them. You work around men in the military long enough, you learn to read the ones who broke from the ones who bent. Same principle applies to civilians. Can you help? Maggie asked. Walt nodded slowly. I can make some calls. I've got contacts from my contracting days. People who know people in the livestock business. Might take a few days, but if there's someone who worked for Crane and left angry, I can probably track them down. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had an hour ago. The next morning, Jim was back at Phantom's paddock before sunrise. The horse was waiting at the fence, which had become routine. Every morning, Phantom would be there, watching for Jim. Every evening the same. Like the horse had learned that Jim was reliable, that he showed up, that he kept his promises. Jim climbed into the paddock and Phantom walked over, no hesitation now. Let Jim touch his neck, his shoulder, run hands over scars and feel the warmth of life that refused to give up despite everything. "Getting better," Jim said quietly. "The leg's almost healed. Stitches can come out in a few days. You're tough, tougher than you got any right to be." Phantom leaned into the touch, soaking up contact like a man dying of thirst. How long, Jim wondered, since this horse had been touched with kindness instead of violence? How long since someone put hands on him that didn't hurt? "Too long, way too long." "We're going to fight for you," Jim said. "Whole team. Maggie, Ben, Sarah, Walt, even the lawyer. Everyone's looking for a way to keep you safe." The horse's good eye watched him, liquid brown and full of something that might have been hope or might have been resignation. Hard to tell with animals. Hard to tell with people, for that matter. Jim spent an hour with Phantom, then helped Ben with morning chores. They fed the other horses, mucked stalls, checked water troughs. Physical work that kept hands busy and minds from dwelling on things they couldn't control. Around noon, a vehicle pulled up the drive, not one of the black SUVs. This was a white truck with Morrison Equine Services painted on the side, Rachel the vet. But when the driver's door opened, it wasn't the young vet Jim remembered from last week. This was someone else. A woman, late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that took in everything with the careful assessment of someone trained to see details others missed. She walked to the house and knocked. Maggie answered, and Jim couldn't hear the conversation from the barn, but he saw Maggie's body language change. Saw her step back, hand over her mouth. Saw her reach out and grab the doorframe like she needed support. Jim dropped the pitchfork and ran. By the time he reached the house, Maggie was sitting on the porch steps, the woman kneeling in front of her, holding her hands. Ben burst out of the barn behind Jim, Sarah close behind. "What happened?" Ben demanded. The woman looked up. "I'm Rachel Lattimer. I'm the associate vet for Morrison Equine Services. Dr. Morrison sent me to do a follow-up check on a horse named Phantom." "Lattimer," Jim said, the name hitting him strange. "That's my name." Rachel stood up and for the first time really looked at him. Her expression went through several changes in quick succession. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, anger. "Dad." The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Jim felt the world tilt sideways, felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the porch railing. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" "I work here. What are you doing here?" "My job. Dr. Morrison couldn't come, so he sent me. I've been with his practice for 3 months. This was supposed to be a simple follow-up." Jim couldn't speak, couldn't process. His daughter who he hadn't seen in 5 years. His daughter who'd stopped returning his calls, stopped answering his emails, who'd made it very clear that having a father who couldn't function in normal society was more than she wanted to deal with. "You two know each other?" Ben asked, looking between them. "He's my father," Rachel said, the word coming out flat and hard. "Or he was, before he decided the army mattered more than his family." "Rachel," Jim started. "No," she held up a hand. "I'm not doing this. I'm here to check on a horse. Where is he?" Maggie stood up slowly. "I'll show you. Jim, stay here." "Maggie, please. Stay here." Rachel grabbed her medical bag from the truck and followed Maggie toward the paddocks without looking back. Jim stood on the porch, feeling like he'd been shot. Ben and Sarah exchanged glances, then quietly moved away, giving him space. Jim sat on the steps where Maggie had been sitting, put his head in his hands. Of all the ranches in Wyoming, of all the vet practices in the state, his daughter ends up here. Now, when everything else was falling apart. The universe, Jim decided, had a sick sense of humor. He sat there for 20 minutes before forcing himself to move. Work. That's what you did when the world fell apart. You worked. You kept your hands busy and your mind focused on things you could control. But as he walked to the barn, he detoured past Phantom's paddock, just to check, just to see. Rachel was inside the paddock, standing 10 feet from Phantom, tablet in hand, making notes. The horse stood calmly, watching her with curiosity instead of fear. Not tense, not ready to bolt, just standing there like this was normal. Sarah stood outside the fence, observing. She saw Jim and walked over. "She's good," Sarah said quietly. "Really good. Been here 5 minutes and already has Phantom calm enough for a visual exam. Haven't seen him that relaxed with a stranger since he arrived." Jim watched his daughter work, professional, competent, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. When had she finished vet school, he'd lost track of everything in her life because he'd been too broken to be part of it. Rachel noticed him watching. Her expression hardened. She said something to Phantom, quiet and calm, then walked to the fence. "He's healing well," she said, professional tone, no emotion. "Shoulder wound is clean, no infection. Leg bruising is resolving. Whoever's been caring for him is doing good work." "That would be Sarah and Jim," Maggie said. Rachel's jaw tightened at Jim's name, but she didn't acknowledge it. "I need to draw blood for a full workup, and I found something in his records that you need to know about." "What?" Rachel pulled up something on her tablet. "Phantom has a microchip, standard practice for registered horses. I scanned him and got a hit. The chip traces back to a registration database, and the ownership records are detailed." "We know Crane owned him," Ben said. "Not just Crane. Before that, there's a previous owner, someone who had him from age 2 to age 4 before Crane purchased him." Rachel turned the tablet around. "A woman named Elena Martinez from a small ranch outside El Paso. I called the number on file. It's disconnected, but the address is still there." "Why does this matter?" Jim asked. Rachel finally looked at him directly. "Because if we can find Elena Martinez, if she's willing to testify about what condition the horse was in when Crane bought him, it establishes a baseline. If Phantom was healthy then and damaged now, that narrows the window of when the abuse occurred." "To when Crane owned him," Maggie said. "Exactly." Hope flickered in Jim's chest. "Can you find her?" "I can try. The address is 7 years old, but it's a start." "I'll go," Jim said. "El Paso. I'll drive there, find her, get her to talk." "That's a 1,000-mile round trip," Ben said. "Don't care. If there's a chance she can help, I'll take it." Rachel was shaking her head. "You can't just show up at someone's door and expect them to talk to you about something that happened 7 years ago." "Why not?" "Because that's not how people work. She'll think you're a scammer or a stalker or worse. You need to approach this carefully." "Then come with me," Jim said. The words were out before he could stop them. Rachel stared at him like he'd suggested they fly to the moon. "Excuse me. You're a vet. You've got credibility. If we show up together, professional and legitimate, she's more likely to talk." "Are you insane? I'm not going anywhere with you." "It's not about me. It's about Phantom, about saving him from going back to Crane." "I don't care about your ranch drama." "Yes, you do," Maggie said quietly. "I saw your face when you examined him. I saw how you looked at those scars. You care about what happened to that horse." Rachel opened her mouth, closed it. looked back at Phantom, who was watching the conversation with his head tilted, ears forward. Even if I wanted to help, which I'm not saying I do, I can't just leave. I have appointments, responsibilities. We can cover for you, Sarah said. Dr. Morrison's practice works with hours all the time. I can handle your appointments for a few days. Rachel looked trapped, looked angry, looked at her father like she was seeing all the years of disappointment and abandonment compressed into one moment. Fine, she said finally, but this is about the horse, not about us, not about fixing whatever you think is broken between us, just the horse. Understood, Jim said. We leave tomorrow morning, early, and I drive. Your truck looks like it's held together with rust and prayer. Yes, ma'am. Rachel gathered her equipment and walked back to her truck without another word. Jim watched her go, feeling something break apart in his chest. His daughter who he'd failed, who he'd abandoned when she needed him because he couldn't figure out how to be a father and a soldier and a functional human being all at the same time. Maggie put a hand on his shoulder. This is good, Jim. This is a chance. A chance for what? To do something right, to help someone who needs it, to maybe start fixing the things you broke. Jim wasn't sure he believed in fixing broken things anymore, but he nodded anyway, because what else was there to do? That night he packed a small bag, change of clothes, toiletries, the photograph he'd been avoiding, the one of Rachel as a little girl, gap-toothed and smiling, sitting on his shoulders like he was a giant and she was invincible. He looked at that photo for a long time, at the trust in that little girl's eyes, and wondered when exactly she'd learned that trust was a mistake. Probably around the time he deployed for the third time, or the fourth, or any of the dozen times he chose war over family because war made sense and family was too complicated and too painful and too full of expectations he couldn't meet. Jim put the photo in his bag and lay down on his bunk. Outside, Wyoming winter wrapped the ranch in cold and darkness. In his paddock, Phantom stood alone but not afraid, waiting for morning when Jim would come back like he always did. And somewhere in Texas, a woman named Elena Martinez was living her life, unaware that tomorrow, two strangers would show up asking her to remember the worst transaction she'd ever made. Jim didn't sleep much, but when he did, he didn't dream of explosions or blood or the faces of dead soldiers. He dreamed of his daughter at age 7, teaching her to ride a bike, running behind her holding the seat, promising he wouldn't let go. And then letting go anyway. Because that's what he'd done. Let go of everything that mattered and held on to everything that destroyed him. Tomorrow, maybe, he could start to change that. Or maybe tomorrow would just prove that some things, once broken, stayed broken forever. He'd find out soon enough. The truck's engine was already running when Jim walked out of the bunkhouse at 5:30 the next morning. Rachel sat in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, jaw set. She didn't acknowledge Jim as he climbed into the passenger seat, didn't speak as she put the truck in gear and headed down the long drive toward the highway. They drove in silence for the first 100 miles. Wyoming landscape rolled past, empty and vast, the kind of country that made you feel small and reminded you that the world didn't care about your problems. Finally, just past the Colorado border, Rachel spoke. I have conditions. Okay. We don't talk about the past. We don't talk about why you left. We don't pretend this is some kind of reconciliation road trip. We find this woman, we get her statement, we come back. That's it. Understood. And when this is over, we go back to our separate lives. I help with the horse because it's the right thing to do, not because I've forgiven you. Jim nodded, I don't expect forgiveness. Good, because you're not getting it. More silence, more miles. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow-covered landscape harsh and bright. How long have you been in Wyoming? Jim asked, breaking his own rule about not talking. 3 months. Got my license in California, worked there for 2 years, then moved for this job. Better pay, better hours, closer to nature. You always wanted to be a vet. Since I was 8, you would know that if you'd been around. The words were meant to hurt. They did. Jim took the hit and said nothing. They stopped for gas in Denver. Rachel went inside to buy coffee. Jim stood by the pump watching traffic and felt the familiar weight of hypervigilance settle over him. Too many vehicles, too many sight lines, too many places for threats to hide. His pulse quickened, his vision narrowed. The gas pump handle felt slippery in his grip. Rachel came back with 2 coffees, handed him one without comment. But she'd noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze kept scanning the parking lot. He could tell by the way her expression shifted, just for a moment, from anger to something that might have been concern. "How bad is it?" she asked as they got back on the road. "What?" "The PTSD, the hypervigilance, the whatever makes your hands shake when you think no one's looking." Jim glanced down. His hands were trembling slightly, the coffee cup unsteady. He set it in the cup holder. "Bad enough that I can't hold down a regular job. Bad enough that loud noises make me hit the ground. Bad enough that I've been homeless off and on for 3 years because I can't function in normal society." Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Have you tried therapy?" "Yeah, VA counseling. Medications, all of it, helps sometimes, doesn't help other times." "What helps the most?" "Phantom," Jim said, surprising himself with the honesty. "Working with him. Being around something that's as broken as I am but still fighting to survive. It gives me something to focus on besides my own mess." Rachel was quiet for a long time. "That's why you won't let Crane take him." "Part of it. The other part is I think Crane destroyed that horse, and I think if he gets him back, he'll finish the job." "Based on what?" "A feeling. Based on the way Phantom reacted when he saw Crane. Based on the look in Crane's eyes when he watched that horse panic. Based on 30 years of looking at men and knowing which ones are capable of cruelty." Rachel didn't argue. They drove on, eating miles, chasing an address that might lead nowhere, pursuing a ghost of a chance. By evening they were in El Paso, tired and stiff from 12 hours on the road. They found a cheap motel near the address they were looking for. 2 rooms. Rachel made that very clear. Separate rooms. Jim lay on a bed that smelled like disinfectant and cigarettes and thought about Phantom, hundreds of miles away, probably wondering why Jim hadn't shown up that morning. Probably thinking he'd been abandoned again. Tomorrow, Jim thought. Tomorrow we find Elena Martinez. Tomorrow we get the truth. Tomorrow we start to fight back. He fell asleep thinking about a gray and white horse with one good eye, and a heart that refused to quit. And hoping that heart could hold on just a little bit longer. The address led them to a street on the east side of El Paso where chain-link fences separated small houses from cracked sidewalks, and the desert tried to reclaim everything. Rachel parked in front of a beige stucco home with bars on the windows and a yard that was more dirt than grass. A rusted swing set stood in the corner, abandoned and skeletal. Jim checked the address again. This was it, 7 years old, but it matched. They sat in the truck for a moment, neither moving. The morning sun was already hot despite it being February, that dry desert heat that felt like breathing sand. "You want to do the talking?" Rachel asked. "You're better at it. I'll just stand there and try not to look threatening." You always look threatening." Jim glanced at her. Was that a joke? Hard to tell with Rachel. She'd barely spoken to him since Denver, maintaining the wall of professional distance like her life depended on it. They got out, walked to the front door. The doorbell didn't work, so Rachel knocked. They waited. No sound from inside. She knocked again, louder. A dog started barking somewhere in the backyard, deep and aggressive. Then footsteps. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain, and a woman's face appeared in the gap. 50s, maybe, with dark hair going gray and eyes that had seen enough trouble to recognize it coming. "Whatever you're selling, I don't want it," she said. "Mrs. Martinez, Elena Martinez." "Who's asking?" Rachel pulled out her veterinary license, held it up. "My name is Dr. Rachel Lattimer. I'm a veterinarian from Wyoming. This is my associate. We're trying to locate information about a horse you owned several years ago. We're not selling anything and we're not with any government agency. We just need a few minutes of your time." The woman studied the license, then their faces. "What horse?" "You sold a gray and white Mustang gelding to Thomas Crane in 2018. The horse would have been 4 years old at the time. Registration name Storm Shadow." Elena's expression changed. Something flickered there, gone too fast to identify, but Jim saw it. Recognition, and something else. Regret, maybe, or fear. "I don't remember," she said. "Mrs. Martinez, please. That horse is in danger. The man you sold him to, we believe he abused the animal severely. We're trying to build a case to keep the horse from going back to him." "Then you should talk to a lawyer." "We have a lawyer. What we need is someone who can testify to the horse's condition before Crane owned him. Someone who can establish that the injuries happened while in Crane's care, not before." Elena started to close the door. Jim put his hand on it, not forcing, just preventing. "Please," he said. 5 minutes, that's all we're asking." Elena looked at his hand, then his face. "You're military." "Was, long time ago." "My husband was too. Marines. Died in Afghanistan in 2012. That's why I sold the horse. Couldn't afford to keep him after Roberto died." Jim pulled his hand back. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Everyone's sorry doesn't bring him back." But she unchained the door and opened it wider. 5 minutes, that's it. Inside, the house was small and neat, filled with photographs of a family that had been whole once. A handsome man in marine dress blues. 2 kids, teenagers now probably, frozen in time on these walls. Elena led them to a living room with furniture that had been nice once, 20 years ago. They sat. Elena remained standing, arms crossed, defensive. "Storm Shadow," she said. "Yeah, I remember him. Roberto bought him from a rescue auction when he was 2. Wild as hell, never been touched by humans except to get branded and gelded. Roberto spent 2 years working with him, gentle as anything, until that horse would follow him around like a dog." "What condition was he in when you sold him?" Rachel asked, taking notes on her tablet. "Perfect, healthy, sound. No injuries except the usual scars from running wild. Roberto loved that horse, called him Shadow. When Roberto deployed the last time, he made me promise I'd take care of Shadow until he got back." Elena's voice cracked. She sat down heavily, like the memories were too much to carry standing. "But Roberto didn't come back. And I had 2 kids to feed and a mortgage I couldn't pay on my own. I tried to keep Shadow for a year, but the boarding costs were killing me. So I sold him." She looked at Rachel with tears in her eyes. "I sold the last piece of my husband because I didn't have a choice." "Who approached you about buying?" Jim asked gently. "Man named Crane. Said he ran a performance horse operation, trained horses for rodeo and exhibition riding. Said Shadow would be perfect for his program. Offered me $12,000 cash. That was more than I could say no to. Did you see where the horse went? What facility? No, Crane brought a trailer, loaded Shadow, gave me the money and left. That was it. Rachel pulled up a photo on her tablet, a recent one of Phantom, showing the scars, the blind eye, the damage. She turned it toward Elena. Is this the same horse? Elena looked at the photo and her hand went to her mouth. Oh God, what did he do? We were hoping you could help us prove what he did. Would you be willing to testify about the condition Shadow was in when you sold him? About the fact that he was healthy and undamaged? Testify like in court? Potentially, yes, or at least provide a sworn statement. Elena stood up, started pacing. I can't get involved in this. Mrs. Martinez, if you don't help, that horse goes back to the man who destroyed him. You don't understand. Crane, he's connected, powerful. I've heard stories about what happens to people who cross him. What stories? Jim asked. Elena stopped pacing, looked at him. After I sold Shadow, I felt guilty. Started asking around about Crane's operation, trying to make sure I'd done the right thing. I found out he had a reputation. Animals dying in training accidents. Employees who quit and then refused to talk about why. I found one guy worked for Crane for 3 years, quit right around the time I sold Shadow. He told me things. Bad things. What was his name? I don't remember. Mexican guy, older. He said Crane was running some kind of underground rodeo thing, illegal betting, animal fighting, sick stuff. He said he quit because he couldn't watch what they were doing to the horses anymore. Jim leaned forward. Do you have any way to contact this person? No, he gave me a phone number in case I wanted to talk more, but when I called a few weeks later, it was disconnected. I let it go, told myself it wasn't my problem anymore. But it is your problem, Rachel said, harder now. You sold a healthy horse to a man who tortured it. You have a chance to make that right. Elena's face flushed. I sold a horse to feed my kids. Don't you dare judge me for that. I'm not judging. I'm asking you to help save an animal's life. By putting my own life at risk. By putting my kids at risk. You think Crane won't come after me if I testify against him? We can arrange protection. Our lawyer. Your lawyer can't protect me from a man who makes people disappear. I'm sorry. I really am, but I can't help you. Jim stood up. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Martinez. We appreciate your honesty. Rachel looked at him, surprised by the sudden surrender. But Jim was already moving toward the door. Sometimes you knew when a fight was lost before it even started. Outside in the truck, Rachel turned to him. We could have pushed harder. No, we couldn't. She's scared. Rightfully so. Forcing her wouldn't have changed anything except make her feel worse. So we came all this way for nothing. Not nothing. We confirmed that Phantom was healthy when Crane bought him. That's something. And we have a lead on this other guy who worked for Crane. Mexican, older, quit around 2018. That's more specific than what we had before. How do we find someone with that description? There are millions of people who fit that profile. Jim was quiet, thinking. Then he pulled out his phone, finally charged, and called Walt. The old man answered on the third ring. Jim, you in Texas yet? Yeah, just talked to the previous owner. She won't testify, but she gave us a lead. Guy who worked for Crane, quit in 2018, Hispanic, older. Said Crane was running illegal operations. You know anyone who might be able to track down former employees? Walt was silent for a moment. Maybe. I know a guy who knows a guy. Let me make some calls. Where you staying? Jim gave him the motel name. Call me if you find anything. Will do. And Jim, Be careful down there. Texas is Crane's territory. He's got friends in low places. They spent the rest of the day driving around El Paso, checking livestock auctions, feed stores, any place where people in the horse business might gather. They showed Phantom's photo, asked about Crane, got a lot of head shakes and closed expressions. By evening, they'd learned that Thomas Crane's name created silence like a stone dropped in water, the ripples spreading outward, everyone backing away from the splash. They ate dinner at a truck stop diner, bad coffee and mediocre food, sitting across from each other in a booth with cracked vinyl seats. Rachel pushed scrambled eggs around her plate, not eating much. "You were different with her," she said finally. "Mrs. Martinez, you didn't push, didn't try to guilt her, just accepted her no." She already felt guilty enough. Adding more wouldn't have helped. "Is that what therapy taught you, or is that something you learned on your own?" Jim looked at her. "That's personal. I thought we weren't doing personal." "We're not. I'm just making an observation." "Then observe this. Some people can be pushed into doing the right thing. Others can't. Elena Martinez has been through enough. I wasn't going to add to it." Rachel nodded slowly. "Roberto Martinez, the husband who died, did you know him?" "No, why?" "Just wondering if that's why you were gentle with her. Veterans Widow Solidarity or something. Or maybe I was gentle because she's a human being who's suffered and doesn't need strangers making it worse." Rachel went back to pushing eggs around. "You weren't always this self-aware." "I wasn't always a lot of things." "Like what?" Jim set down his coffee cup. "Like broken, like homeless, like a father who abandoned his daughter because he couldn't figure out how to be human anymore. Pick your favorite." The words hung between them, raw and honest. Rachel's jaw tightened. "We weren't going to do this," she said. "You're right, we weren't." They finished eating in silence, paid, went back to the motel, separate rooms, separate lives that happened to be occupying the same space for a little while. Jim lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the highway through thin walls, and thought about Elena Martinez selling the last piece of her husband because survival demanded it. He understood that. Understood selling pieces of yourself to keep going. He'd sold his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, his self-respect. All of it traded for the ability to make it through one more day without eating a bullet. Some trades were worth it, others haunted you forever. His phone rang at 11 p.m. "Walt." "Found your guy," Walt said without preamble. "Carlos Mendoza. Worked for Crane from 2015 to 2018 as a stable manager. Quit under mysterious circumstances. Currently living in Las Cruces, New Mexico, about 40 miles from where you are." "How'd you find him?" "Friend of a friend who used to work rodeo circuit. Remembered Carlos because the guy left the business entirely after working for Crane. Opened a landscaping company, stays away from horses now." "You have an address?" Walt rattled it off. Jim wrote it on the motel notepad. "Jim," Walt said carefully, "the guy who gave me this info, he said Carlos doesn't talk about his time with Crane. Says the man's scared of something. So whatever you do, don't push too hard. Scared people do unpredictable things." "Understood, thanks, Walt." "Yeah, and Jim, something else you should know. I did some digging into Crane's military record. Called in some favors with guys who still have access. His service record is mostly clean, commendations, Purple Heart, the works. But there's a gap. 3 months in early 1970 where there's no record of where he was or what unit he was with." "A gap?" "Yeah, like someone scrubbed it, or classified it. Usually means black ops or something the military wanted buried. I've seen it before with guys who did things in Vietnam that weren't officially sanctioned. Jim felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of things? The kind that don't make it into history books. Phoenix program stuff. Interrogations. Village pacification. The missions they sent men on who didn't ask questions and didn't talk after. You think Crane was involved in war crimes? I think there's a reason part of his record is missing. And I think men who learn to do terrible things in war sometimes keep doing terrible things in peace. Just a thought. They hung up. Jim sat on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, thinking about gaps in service records and missing months, and the kind of man who could come back from war and turn cruelty into a business model. The next morning, Jim and Rachel drove to Las Cruces. The address led them to a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, well-maintained, with a landscaping company truck in the driveway and a yard that showed professional attention. A man in his 50s answered the door. Medium height, stocky build, weathered face. He wore work clothes and dirt under his fingernails. When he saw them, his expression immediately shuddered. "Not interested," he said, starting to close the door. "Mr. Mendoza, Carlos Mendoza." The man froze. "Who's asking?" "My name is Rachel Lattimer. I'm a veterinarian. This is Jim Lattimer. We're trying to get information about a horse that you may have known when you worked for Thomas Crane." Carlos's face went pale. "I don't work for Crane, haven't in years." "We know, that's why we're here. We need to talk to someone who worked for him and got out." "No, no way, I'm not talking about that." He tried to close the door, but Jim put his boot in the gap. Not aggressive, just present. "Mr. Mendoza, a horse is going to die if we can't prove what Crane did to him. A horse that someone you knew probably cared about." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Storm Shadow, gray and white Mustang, bought from a widow in El Paso in 2018. You were working for Crane then, you had to have seen him." Something broke in Carlos's face. Pain sudden and sharp. "Get out of here, leave me alone." "Please," Rachel said, "just 5 minutes, that's all we're asking." I said no. "A man died," Jim said quietly, taking a chance, playing a hunch based on what Alina had said. "Someone you knew, someone who worked with you, and it wasn't an accident, was it?" Carlos's eyes went wide. "How do you know about Miguel?" "I don't, but I know men like Crane don't leave loose ends. And I know people who quit working for him tend to either get paid off or disappear. Which one were you?" Carlos looked at Jim for a long moment, and whatever he saw there, whatever recognition passed between two men who'd both seen darkness, made him step back and open the door wider. "Come in, but if anyone asks, you were never here." The living room was neat and sparse, photographs of family on the walls, but something missing in the way they were arranged, like the house was trying too hard to look normal. Carlos sat heavily, put his head in his hands. "Miguel was my brother, older by 3 years. We grew up around horses, worked ranches our whole lives. When Crane hired us in 2015, we thought it was a good opportunity. Good pay, professional operation. We were idiots." "What happened?" Rachel asked gently. "At first everything seemed normal. Training horses for rodeo, working them in round pens, standard stuff. But after a few months, Crane started bringing in different animals. Wild horses, Mustangs from BLM roundups, horses from kill pens. He'd buy them cheap and then work them hard. Real hard." Carlos looked up, eyes haunted. He had methods. Training methods, he said, were old school, proven effective, but they weren't training. They were torture. Electric prods, spiked bits, starvation. He'd break them down until they were either completely submissive or completely insane. The submissive ones he'd sell for good money. The insane ones he'd use for other things. What things? Jim asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. Illegal rodeo, underground stuff, rich people who liked watching animals fight and suffer. He'd film it, sell the videos. Some of the horses, he'd let them get injured bad in these events, then he'd claim they died in training accidents for the insurance money. It was a whole operation, profitable as hell and completely evil. Rachel was taking notes, fingers shaking slightly, and Miguel found out. We both found out, but Miguel, he couldn't stay quiet. He started documenting everything, taking photos, videos on his phone, keeping records. He said we had to go to the authorities, shut the operation down. But you didn't, Jim said. Carlos's face crumpled. I was scared. Crane had connections. Police, judges, people in the state government. I told Miguel to let it go, take the money, get out, but Miguel wouldn't listen. He said someone had to stop it. What happened to him? There was a horse, Storm Shadow, beautiful animal. Crane bought him from some widow, brought him in for breaking. Miguel fell in love with that horse, spent extra time with him trying to gentle him before Crane could destroy him. One night Miguel told me he was going to take Storm Shadow and run. Just load him in a trailer and disappear. I told him he was crazy. Crane would hunt him down. Carlos stood up, started pacing. 2 days later, Miguel was dead. Official report said training accident. Said Storm Shadow spooked and trampled him. But I knew. I knew because I saw Crane that morning, saw the look in his eyes. He'd found out what Miguel was planning. He made that horse panic on purpose. Made sure Miguel was in the pen when it happened. Made it look like an accident. The room was silent, except for Carlos's ragged breathing. I couldn't prove it, Carlos continued. No witnesses, no evidence, just a dead brother and a horse that was so traumatized afterward he tried to kill anyone who came near him. Crane sold the horse a few weeks later, said it was too dangerous to keep. I think he sold it to get rid of evidence. And then Crane came to me with an offer. Let me guess, Jim said, money to keep quiet. $2 million, cash, plus a threat. He said if I ever talked about what happened, if I ever went to the police or the media, I'd end up like Miguel, and my wife, and my kids, so I took the money. I buried my brother, and I've been living with that guilt every day since. Rachel looked up from her notes. You have proof, the documentation Miguel made. Carlos nodded slowly. Miguel gave me a USB drive the night before he died, said it was insurance. Videos, photos, everything. I've kept it hidden. Never looked at it, too afraid of what I'd see. Would you be willing to let us see it? Jim asked. Would you be willing to testify? Testify against Crane? Are you insane? We have a lawyer. We can arrange protection. Protection won't stop Crane. The man has people everywhere. You think I don't know what happened to the other employees who tried to talk? 2 disappeared completely. 1 died in a car accident. 1 had their house burned down with them in it. Crane doesn't leave witnesses. Then Storm Shadow goes back to him, Rachel said. And everything Miguel died trying to prevent, it all happens again. Carlos looked at her with tears in his eyes. That horse is still alive. Barely, he's damaged, blind in 1 eye, covered in scars, terrified of humans, but alive, and fighting every day to stay that way. Where is he? Wyoming, on a rescue ranch, being cared for by people who actually give a damn. Carlos was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up and left the room. Came back 5 minutes later with a small USB drive. He held it like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This is everything, he said. Miguel's documentation, but I can't testify. I can't put my family at risk. The drive is enough, Jim said, reaching for it. Carlos pulled it back. You need to understand something. What's on here, it's not just animal abuse. It's evidence of organized crime, racketeering, maybe murder. If you use this, Crane won't just fight you in court. He'll come after you, all of you. We'll take that chance. Carlos handed over the drive. His hand was shaking. There's video of Storm's shadow, of what Crane did to him. It's bad, really bad. I watched about 30 seconds before I had to stop. No one should have to see that. We'll watch it, Rachel said. And if you do go after Crane, if you actually try to take him down, you tell Storm's shadow something for me. Tell him Miguel tried to save him. Tell him my brother died trying to do the right thing. Jim took the drive and put it carefully in his jacket pocket. We'll tell him. They drove back toward El Paso in silence. The USB drive sat between them on the console like a live grenade. Rachel kept glancing at it. We should watch it, she said. See what we're dealing with. Not here, not in the truck. We need to be somewhere secure, and we need our lawyer present. Jim, we drove 1,000 miles for this. We can't wait. We can and we will. This is evidence in a potential criminal case. Chain of custody matters. We do this right or it won't hold up in court. Rachel looked at him with something that might have been respect. When did you learn about chain of custody? Worked with JAG officers in the military. Testified in a few courts-martial. Picked up things. They got back to the motel. Jim called Ortiz, explained what they had. The lawyer was quiet for a long moment. You're telling me you have video evidence of Thomas Crane torturing animals? According to the source, yes. And the source is credible. The source is the brother of a man who died trying to stop Crane. I'd say that's pretty credible. But he won't testify. No, too scared. Ortiz sighed. Video without testimony is problematic. Defense can argue chain of custody, authenticity, editing, but it's more than we had. Get back here as soon as you can. Don't watch the video. Don't copy it. Don't let it out of your sight. And for God's sake, don't tell anyone you have it. Understood. They checked out of the motel and started the long drive back to Wyoming. Jim drove the first shift, Rachel sleeping in the passenger seat, exhausted from 2 days of emotional intensity. Jim kept the drive in his jacket pocket, felt its weight like a stone over his heart. Somewhere on that drive was proof of what Crane had done. Proof that would either save Phantom or get them all killed trying. He didn't know which outcome was more likely. By the time they reached the Colorado border, it was late afternoon. Jim's eyes were gritty with fatigue. They stopped for gas and bad coffee. Rachel took over driving. Jim tried to sleep but couldn't, his mind racing through possibilities and dangers and the look on Carlos Mendoza's face when he talked about his dead brother. His phone rang. Maggie. Jim, where are you? About 6 hours out. We got what we came for. How's Phantom? There was a pause too long. Jim sat up straight. Maggie. There was a fire last night, she said, voice carefully controlled. The barn, it's gone. Jim felt his blood go cold. The horses. We got them out, all of them. Ben saw the flames, got everyone moving fast enough. No animals died. But it wasn't an accident, Jim. Fire marshal found evidence of accelerant. Someone poured gasoline around the foundation and lit it. This was arson. Rachel had heard enough of the conversation to pull over. Jim put the phone on speaker. Do they know who? Jim asked. No suspects yet, but Jim, there's more. We found something outside Phantom's paddock, a dead bird, crow. Someone wrung its neck and left it on the fence post. A message, Jim said. That's what the sheriff thinks. Someone's trying to scare us, and it's working. Jim looked at Rachel. She looked back, fear and anger mixing in her expression. "We're coming back now," Jim said. "Don't go anywhere alone, stay together. And Maggie, we found proof. We found evidence that Crane tortured Phantom. It's on a USB drive. When we get back, we're going to bury him with it." "You think he's behind the fire?" "I don't think, I know. He's escalating, trying to make us back down before we can use what we have against him. But we're not backing down." "Jim, maybe we should. Maybe this isn't worth people getting hurt." "It's worth it, trust me. We're too close to stop now." They hung up. Rachel was already pulling back onto the highway, driving faster now, urgency replacing caution. "He burned down the barn," she said. "He could have killed those horses." "He doesn't care about the horses. He cares about control, about making sure we know what happens if we fight back." "Then what do we do?" "We fight harder." They drove through the night, taking turns, pushing the limits of speed and safety. Jim's mind kept going back to that dead crow on the fence post. The symbolism was clear. This is what happens to things that annoy me. This is what I can do. But Crane had made a mistake. He'd escalated to violence before knowing what they had, before knowing that his own cruelty was documented on a drive currently sitting in Jim's pocket. By the time they reached Wyoming, the sun was rising, painting the snow-covered landscape gold and red, beautiful and cold and indifferent to human drama. They pulled into Redemption Ridge to find the barn reduced to blackened timber and ash. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. Maggie stood in the yard with Ben and Sarah, looking exhausted and defiant. Walt was there too, leaning on his cane, jaw set. Phantom stood in his paddock, alive and safe, watching Jim's return with an intensity that felt like relief. Jim got out of the truck and went straight to Maggie, handed her the USB drive. "This is everything. Carlos Mendoza's brother documented Crane's operation before he died. Video, photos, records, everything we need to prove what he did." "How did the brother die?" Maggie asked. "Crane killed him, made it look like an accident with Storm Shadow." Maggie took the drive with shaking hands. "Then we need to get this to the police, to the FBI, to someone who can actually do something." "We will, but first we watch it. We need to know what we're dealing with." They set up in the main house, laptop on the kitchen table, everyone gathered around. Ortiz had driven up overnight, arriving just as they were preparing to view the evidence. The lawyer looked grim. "Before we start," he said, "I need to warn you. Whatever's on this drive, you can't unsee it. And once we watch it, we're committed. We use this evidence, we're declaring war on a dangerous man." "We're already at war," Ben said, gesturing toward the burned barn. "He declared it for us." Ortiz nodded and plugged in the drive. The first file was dated April 2018. The video quality was shaky, shot on a phone, but the audio was clear, and what it showed made Jim's stomach turn. A round pen. Storm Shadow, younger but recognizable, being worked by two men with electric cattle prods. The horse screaming, trying to escape, crashing into the fence. Crane's voice off camera, calm and instructional, explaining technique like he was teaching a cooking class. "You want to break the spirit without breaking the body. Too much damage and you can't sell them, just enough to make them compliant." The video showed 15 minutes of systematic torture. By the end, Storm Shadow was standing in the center of the pen, sides heaving, covered in sweat and small burns, eyes empty of everything except fear. Rachel was crying silently. Sarah had her hand over her mouth. Maggie's jaw was clenched so tight Jim could see the muscles jumping. There were more videos. Dozens. Different horses, different dates, all the same methodical cruelty. and in several of them Crane was visible, participating, directing, sometimes inflicting the damage himself with a smile that never reached his eyes. The final video was dated June 2018. Miguel Mendoza's voice narrated from behind the camera. "This is my last recording. I'm getting Storm Shadow out tonight. If something happens to me, this drive goes to my brother Carlos. He'll know what to do with it. To whoever's watching this, Thomas Crane is a monster, and someone needs to stop him before he destroys more lives." The video ended. The room was silent except for the sound of Rachel's quiet sobbing. Jim stood up and walked outside. Needed air, needed space, needed to not be in a room where he just watched systematic torture. He went to Phantom's paddock. The horse came to the fence immediately, pressed his head against Jim's chest. Jim wrapped his arms around Phantom's neck and held on. "I saw what he did to you," Jim whispered. "I saw it all, and I swear to God I'll make him pay for it." Behind him he heard footsteps. Rachel. "We're calling the FBI," she said. "Ortiz says this is enough for racketeering charges. Maybe murder charges for Miguel. They'll open an investigation." "How long will that take?" "Months, maybe years." "We don't have months. The hearing is in 10 days. Then we use it in court. Show the judge. Make it impossible for Crane to claim he didn't abuse this horse." Jim nodded. It was something, not enough but something. They walked back to the house together. For the first time since El Paso, Rachel took his hand. Just for a moment. Just long enough to squeeze once, a gesture that said we're in this together whether we like it or not. Inside, Ortiz was already on the phone with the FBI. Maggie was making copies of the drive. Ben was documenting everything for their court case. Walt sat in the corner, old eyes seeing something far away, maybe another war, maybe just the truth that evil never really dies, it just changes uniforms. And somewhere in Texas, Thomas Crane was probably just waking up, drinking his coffee, reading his newspaper, secure in the knowledge that money and power could bury anything. But he didn't know yet what they had. Didn't know the dead man had left a testament. Didn't know the fight was just beginning. The war had started with a barn fire and a dead crow. It was about to end with the truth. Or with all of them burning. Time would tell which. The FBI arrived 3 days after they submitted the evidence. 2 agents in dark suits and government vehicles, asking questions, taking statements, making copies of Miguel's videos. They were professional and thorough and completely non-committal about what would happen next. "These things take time," the lead agent said, a woman named Morrison who had the eyes of someone who'd seen humanity's worst and stopped being surprised by it. "Building a RICO case against someone with Crane's resources, we're talking months minimum, more likely years." "We don't have years," Maggie said. "We have 6 days until the court hearing. After that, the horse goes back to him." Civil court and criminal investigations are separate tracks. We can't stop a property dispute just because we're investigating the property owner for other crimes. So Phantom goes back to his abuser while you build your case. Morrison's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you different, but unless we get an indictment before your hearing, there's nothing we can do." The agents left. The team sat around the kitchen table in silence, the weight of reality pressing down like a physical thing. 6 days, Ben said. "We have 6 days to figure out how to win a legal battle against a man with unlimited resources and no conscience." "We have the videos," Sarah said. "We show them to the judge, make it impossible to ignore what he did." Ortiz shook his head. "Defense will argue chain of custody. They'll say the videos are fabricated or taken out of context, or that we can't prove they show Crane's facility. Without Carlos testifying, without someone to authenticate the footage, it's just digital files that could have come from anywhere. So we're back to nothing, Rachel said. Not nothing. We have documentation of Phantom's current injuries. We have expert testimony from Sarah about the pattern of abuse. We have the microchip records proving the horse was healthy when Alina sold him. It's circumstantial, but it builds a picture. A picture that Crane's lawyers will tear apart in 5 minutes, Jim said quietly. He'd been silent until now, sitting at the table with his coffee mug gripped tight between both palms. We need something they can't argue with, something definitive. Like what? Ben asked. Jim looked up. Like Crane himself, we need him to admit what he did. That's not going to happen. Maybe it will. Men like Crane, they're arrogant. They think they're untouchable. Sometimes that arrogance makes them careless. Walt, who'd been sitting in his usual corner, spoke up for the first time. Jim's right. I've seen it before. Men who get away with evil for long enough, they start to believe they're above consequences. They get cocky, make mistakes. What kind of mistakes? Maggie asked. The kind where they brag, where they can't help but let you know how clever they are, how they beat the system. Walt leaned forward on his cane. I got a story about Crane, something I didn't tell you before because I wasn't sure it mattered, but maybe it does now. Everyone turned to look at him. I told you Crane's service record had a gap, Walt continued. 3 months in 1970 where there's no official record. I did more digging. Found a guy who served in the same area, different unit, but he heard stories, rumors about an operation that went wrong. Walt's voice got quieter, harder. There was a village on the Cambodian border. Intelligence said it was a Viet Cong stronghold. Crane's unit was sent in to clear it, but it wasn't a stronghold. It was just a village, farmers, families, and Crane's unit killed them anyway, 23 people, women, children, executed. The room went silent. Jim felt something cold wrap around his spine. There was one survivor, Walt said. A boy, maybe 10 years old. He watched it happen. He testified to Army investigators, but the investigation got buried. Crane got reassigned, the unit got disbanded, and the whole thing disappeared. The official story became that the village was caught in crossfire between U.S. and VC forces. Accidental casualties of war. How do you know this? Ortiz asked. Because I was there. Not in Crane's unit, but in the region. And I knew the investigator who tried to build the case. He told me about it years later when he was dying of cancer and wanted someone to know the truth. He said Crane was the worst kind of soldier, the kind who enjoyed it, who saw the war as permission to do things he'd always wanted to do but civilization wouldn't allow. Walt looked at Jim. You asked what kind of man Crane is. That's what kind. A man who learned in Vietnam that he could kill without consequence, and he's been applying that lesson ever since. Jim stood up, walked to the window. Outside, Phantom stood in his rebuilt paddock, the temporary structure they'd thrown together after the fire. The horse was watching the house, waiting, always waiting. We can't use a massacre from 50 years ago in a civil property dispute, Ortiz said. Even if we could prove it, which we can't, it's not relevant to the current case. It's relevant, Jim said, still looking out the window, because it shows pattern, shows who he is at his core. And maybe, just maybe, if we push the right buttons, he'll show that to the judge himself. What are you thinking? Maggie asked. Jim turned back to the room. I'm thinking we go into that courtroom and we don't just defend keeping Phantom. We go on offense. We accuse Crane of torture, of murder, of being the monster he is. We make him angry, angry enough that he drops the mask. That's a huge risk, Ortiz said. If we make accusations we can't prove, we could be liable for defamation. We could lose the case and end up owing Crane damages. We're going to lose anyway if we play it safe. The man has paperwork and lawyers and money. What we have is the truth, so we use it. Rachel was looking at Jim with an expression he couldn't quite read. You sound like you're preparing for combat. Because I am. This is war. And in war, sometimes you have to take risks that look like suicide because playing it safe guarantees you lose. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation. Ortiz prepped their witnesses, built their case, created a presentation that walked through Phantom's injuries and traced them back to the period when Crane owned him. Sarah compiled medical reports. Ben created a timeline. Rachel worked with Phantom every day, documenting his progress, showing that the horse could heal with proper care. And Jim spent every spare moment with Phantom, building trust, deepening connection, preparing the horse for what was coming. On the evening before the hearing, Jim sat in Phantom's paddock as the sun set, painting the Wyoming sky in colors that looked like fire and blood. The horse stood next to him, head lowered, breathing slow and steady. Tomorrow we go to court, Jim said quietly. Tomorrow we find out if the truth matters more than money. And if it doesn't, if we lose, I want you to know something. Phantom's ear flicked toward Jim's voice. I want you to know that you changed me. That knowing you, working with you, learning to trust again through you, that saved my life. I came here broken and ready to give up. And you showed me that broken doesn't mean finished. That we can survive things that should have killed us. That we can find purpose in the wreckage. Jim's voice cracked. So if we lose tomorrow, if they take you away from me, I need you to remember that you're worth fighting for. That you matter. That you're not just property or a thing to be used. You're a living soul who deserves peace. Phantom lowered his head and rested it on Jim's shoulder, the weight of it familiar now, comforting. They sat like that as darkness fell and stars emerged, two damaged things holding each other up. Rachel found them there an hour later. She climbed into the paddock and sat down on Jim's other side, not speaking, just present. After a long silence, she said, I looked up your service record. After you told me about the men who died, I wanted to understand. Jim tensed. Rachel, you don't need to. I read the after-action reports. I read the investigation. And I read the conclusion. That you made the best decision you could with the intelligence you had. That the building being rigged wasn't something you could have predicted. That their deaths weren't your fault. Doesn't matter what the reports say. I was in command. They died, that's on me. Is that why you left? Why you couldn't come home? Jim was quiet for a long time. I left because every time I looked at you, I saw those men, saw their families, saw the futures they'd never have, and I couldn't reconcile being someone's father when I'd taken fathers away from other children. It didn't feel fair, didn't feel right. So you punished yourself and us. Yes. Rachel reached over and took his hand. That was the wrong choice. You should have stayed, should have let us help you carry it. But I understand why you made it. And I understand that you've been carrying it alone for 12 years because you thought that's what you deserved. She squeezed his hand. You were wrong, you deserved help, you deserved family, you deserved a chance to heal, but you're getting that chance now with him. She nodded toward Phantom. So don't waste it. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't let Crane take that away from you. Jim couldn't speak. Could only nod and hold his daughter's hand and feel something in his chest that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. They sat together until the cold drove them inside. 3 souls bound by damage and the fragile hope that healing might actually be possible. The courthouse was a granite building in downtown Casper, built in the 30s with the kind of solid permanence meant to suggest that justice was eternal and unchanging. Jim had his doubts about that, but he climbed the steps anyway, flanked by Maggie and Rachel, with Ben and Sarah and Walt following behind. Ortiz met them in the hallway outside the courtroom. Crane's already inside, brought 4 lawyers and a dozen character witnesses. Ranchers, business associates, a state senator. They're going to paint him as a pillar of the community. Good, Jim said. Makes it harder for him to hide what he really is. They entered the courtroom. It was smaller than Jim expected, wood-paneled and formal, with benches that looked like church pews and a judge's bench that loomed over everything. Crane sat at the defendant's table, surrounded by his legal team, looking calm and confident in an expensive suit. When he saw Jim, something flickered in his eyes: recognition, assessment, the look of a predator sizing up potential threat. Jim stared back and didn't blink. The judge entered. The Honorable Patricia Morno, 63 years old, with steel gray hair, and a face that suggested she'd presided over enough human foolishness to be thoroughly unimpressed by all of it. This is a preliminary hearing in the matter of Crane versus Henson, regarding ownership and return of property, specifically one horse. I've reviewed the briefs from both sides. Mr. Crane, your counsel may proceed. Crane's lead attorney stood. Gerald Blackwood, 70 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who'd never lost a case in his life. He presented their case with surgical precision: documentation of ownership, registration papers, bill of sale, veterinary records from before the seizure, testimony from Crane about purchasing the horse legally and having him stolen by radical activists. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of property rights. My client legally owned this animal. That animal was taken from him without due process. Texas authorities investigated and found no evidence of wrongdoing. The animal control raid that seized Storm Shadow was later determined to be based on false allegations from animal rights extremists with an agenda. My client simply wants back what is rightfully his. Blackwood sat down. Judge Morno looked at Ortiz, counsel for the defense. Ortiz stood. He looked rumpled and outmatched in his 20-year-old blazer, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, this case isn't about property rights. It's about preventing the return of a severely traumatized animal to the person who caused that trauma. We will show that the horse in question, currently called Phantom, exhibits injuries and behavioral patterns consistent with long-term, systematic abuse. We will show that this abuse occurred during the period when Thomas Crane owned the animal. And we will show that returning Phantom to Crane would constitute animal cruelty by any reasonable standard. He gestured to Sarah. We have expert testimony from a licensed veterinarian who has documented Phantom's current condition. We have testimony from the previous owner about the horse's health before Crane purchased him. And we have evidence suggesting that Crane has a pattern of abusing animals in his care. Blackwood was on his feet immediately. Objection. Counsel is making accusations without foundation. There has never been a conviction, never even a charge, of animal abuse against my client. Because witnesses disappear and evidence gets buried, Ortiz shot back. Counsel will refrain from inflammatory statements not supported by evidence, Judge Morno said. But I'll allow the testimony. Let's hear what you have. Sarah took the stand first. She walked through Phantom's injuries with clinical precision: the scars from electric prods, the blindness from blunt force trauma, the evidence of malnutrition, the behavioral indicators of severe PTSD. She showed photographs, X-rays, medical reports. In my professional opinion, Sarah concluded, this animal was subjected to prolonged, intentional cruelty. The pattern of injuries is inconsistent with accidental trauma or normal training mishaps. Someone systematically tortured this horse. Blackwood cross-examined. Can you testify with certainty about when these injuries occurred? The scars are old, some dating back years. But you can't pinpoint exactly when. No. So these injuries could have occurred while the horse was in the custody of the Animal Rescue Organization, or at Mrs. Henson's ranch. That's extremely unlikely given the healing patterns and... But possible. Sarah hesitated. Technically possible, yes. No further questions. Ortiz called Elena Martinez next. She'd agreed to testify at the last minute, driven by guilt and Rachel's persuasion. She looked terrified on the stand, voice wavering, but her testimony was clear. Storm Shadow had been healthy when she sold him. No injuries, no behavioral problems, a good horse who trusted humans. Blackwood's cross-examination was brutal. He implied she was lying to ease her conscience, suggested she might have abused the horse herself and was now trying to shift blame. By the time he finished, Elena was in tears. Rachel testified about the microchip records, about Phantom's current condition, about the progress he'd made with proper care. Blackwood dismissed her testimony as the observations of an inexperienced veterinarian with an obvious bias. Then Ortiz called Jim. Jim walked to the stand feeling every eye in the courtroom on him. He was sworn in and sat down, keeping his breathing steady, focusing on the moment instead of the pressure. Ortiz began gently. "Mr. Lattimer, can you describe your experience working with Phantom?" Jim took a breath. When I first met him, he was terrified, violent, wouldn't let anyone near him. He'd been beaten so badly and so often that his default response to humans was to attack or flee, usually attack. And over time I worked with him, slowly, carefully, using techniques I learned training military dogs, building trust through consistency and patience, and he responded, started to calm down, started to trust, started to remember that not all humans are threats. In your opinion, what caused Phantom's trauma? Systematic abuse, the kind that breaks an animal's spirit through repeated pain and fear. Someone taught him that humans are dangerous, that trust leads to suffering, that there's no safety anywhere. Blackwood stood for cross-examination. He smiled, the expression cold and calculating. "Mr. Lattimer, you testified that you worked with military dogs. What was your military specialty?" "Special Forces, explosive detection." "And you were discharged when?" 2013. "Under what circumstances?" Ortiz was on his feet. Objection, relevance. "Your Honor, I'm establishing the witness's credibility and mental state." Judge Morneau frowned. "I'll allow it, but get to the point quickly." Blackwood turned back to Jim. "You were discharged for medical reasons, correct? Specifically, psychological trauma." "PTSD, yes." "And you've struggled with that condition for 12 years. Difficulty maintaining employment, periods of homelessness." Objection, Ortiz was standing. "This is character assassination." "It's relevant to whether this witness can accurately assess an animal's psychological state when his own psychology is compromised." Judge Morneau looked at Jim. "Mr. Lattimer, do you feel your PTSD affects your ability to evaluate Phantom's condition?" Jim met her eyes. "No, Your Honor. If anything, it makes me more qualified. I know what trauma looks like because I've lived it. I know what systematic abuse does to someone because I've carried those scars. And I know that Phantom's fear isn't random. It's learned. Someone taught him to be afraid, and that someone is sitting right there." He pointed at Crane. The courtroom erupted. Blackwood objected. Ortiz tried to redirect. Judge Morneau gavelled for order. But Jim wasn't done. "Thomas Crane is a sadist. He tortured that horse for years because he enjoys causing pain, And if you give Phantom back to him, you're sentencing an innocent animal to death." "Mr. Lattimer, that's enough," Judge Morneau said. "No, it's not enough, because we have proof. Video evidence of Crane torturing Phantom, documented evidence of his pattern of abuse, evidence of murder." Crane was on his feet now, face flushed with rage. "That's a lie. Your Honor, this man is clearly unbalanced. His entire testimony should be stricken." "Sit down, Mr. Crane," the judge said. But Crane was beyond control now, the mask finally cracking. "I've spent my life building my reputation, contributing to my community. I won't sit here and be accused of crimes by some broken soldier who can't even hold down a job." "I said sit down." "You want to talk about abuse? Let's talk about how these so-called rescuers stole my property, how they've been poisoning my horse against me, how they're using him to extract money from sympathetic donors. I've seen the fundraising campaigns. This whole thing is a scam." Jim stood up in the witness box. "The only scam here is you pretending to be human. We know what you did in Vietnam. We know about the village, the massacre, the 23 people you murdered." The courtroom went silent, Crane's face drained of color. "We know you've been running from that your whole life," Jim continued, voice steady despite the tension vibrating through every muscle. "We know you learned in that jungle that you could hurt people without consequence, and you've been doing it ever since, to animals, to employees, to anyone who gets in your way." "Your Honor, I move for an immediate mistrial," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Crane was staring at Jim with pure hatred. "You don't know anything. I know Miguel Mendoza is dead because he tried to save Phantom from you. I know you made it look like an accident. I know his brother has evidence, video evidence of you torturing animals, and I know the FBI is building a case right now." "Lies, all lies." "Then explain the videos. Explain your voice on those recordings, giving instructions on how to break a horse's spirit. Explain why every employee who tried to speak out against you either disappeared or ended up dead." Crane took a step toward Jim, and something in his expression made every veteran in the room tense. Jim recognized that look, had seen it on men in combat who'd crossed a line and couldn't come back. "You want to know the truth?" Crane said, voice low and dangerous. "Fine, here's the truth. That horse was mine. I paid for him. I trained him my way. And if he couldn't handle the training, that's his weakness, not my fault. Animals are tools. You use them until they break, then you get new ones." "Thomas, shut up," Blackwood hissed. But Crane was beyond listening. Years of getting away with everything had made him arrogant, and Jim's accusations had finally pushed him over the edge. "You think I'm the monster? Look at what war did to you. You're pathetic, broken, useless. At least I came back from Vietnam stronger. At least I made something of myself instead of crying about ghosts." "The ghosts you made," Jim said quietly, "the ones you murdered. They were enemy combatants, collateral damage, the cost of war. They were children." Crane's face twisted. "They were in the way, and when something's in your way, you remove it. That's what I learned in that jungle. That's what I've applied ever since. And no amount of bleeding heart sentiment changes the fact that I won. I survived. I prospered, while men like you fell apart." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Every word Crane had just said was being recorded by the court stenographer. Every admission, every revelation of who he really was. Judge Morneau's face was pale. "Mr. Crane, I strongly suggest you stop talking." But something in Crane had broken. The dam that had held back decades of carefully maintained facade was collapsing. "I did what I had to do," he said. "In Vietnam, in business, with animals that didn't cooperate, with people who threatened me. I did what was necessary to survive and succeed, and I don't apologize for it." Ortiz was on his feet. "Your Honor, I request that Mr. Crane's statements be entered into the record as admission of abuse." Blackwood was desperately trying to control his client, but Crane shook him off. "You think you've won?" Crane said to Jim. "You think this changes anything? I have lawyers, I have money, I have connections. This courtroom means nothing. That horse is legally mine and I'll get him back." "No," Judge Morneau said, and her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You won't." Everyone turned to look at her. "In my 30 years on the bench," she said, "I have rarely encountered someone so clearly devoid of basic humanity. Mr. Crane, your own testimony has convinced me that returning Phantom to your custody would constitute a death sentence for that animal." She looked at the stenographer. "Let the record show that I am denying the plaintiff's petition for return of property. Furthermore, I am ordering that all rights to the animal previously registered as Storm Shadow be permanently terminated. The horse will remain in the custody of Margaret Henson at Redemption Ridge Ranch." Crane's face went purple. "You can't do that. I have property rights." "You forfeited those rights when you admitted to abuse. The law allows me to sever ownership in cases of demonstrated cruelty. Your own words just demonstrated it." "I'll appeal. I'll take this to the state Supreme Court." "You're free to try, but I'll be forwarding the transcript of this hearing to the FBI, to local law enforcement, and to every media outlet in Wyoming. Your admissions today go far beyond animal abuse. I suspect you'll be too busy defending yourself on criminal charges to pursue civil litigation." Judge Morneau stood. "This hearing is concluded. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Crane from the courtroom before I hold him in contempt for the expression he's currently giving me." Crane was led out, still shouting threats, still insisting he'd win. Blackwood and his legal team followed, looking shell-shocked. Jim sat down hard in the witness box, adrenaline draining from his system, leaving him weak. It was over. They'd won. Maggie was crying. Rachel was hugging Sarah. Ben was shaking Ortiz's hand. Walt sat in the back row with tears running down his weathered face. Jim stepped down from the stand and walked to Maggie. She grabbed him and held on. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Jim said. "You never gave up on him." "Neither did you." They stood there, holding each other, while the courtroom slowly emptied, and the reality of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters had already gathered. News of Crane's meltdown had spread fast. Cameras and microphones thrust toward them, voices calling questions. Ortiz handled them with practiced ease. Today justice was served. A severely abused animal was protected from the man who tortured him. That's all we have to say right now. They pushed through the crowd and made it to the vehicles. The drive back to Redemption Ridge felt surreal, like moving through a dream. Jim kept expecting to wake up and find out it was all wishful thinking. But when they pulled into the ranch and he saw Phantom standing at the fence, watching for him, he knew it was real. Jim went straight to the paddock. Phantom came to him immediately, pressed against the fence, making that soft sound that meant recognition and relief. "We won," Jim said, voice breaking. "You're safe, you're staying. No one can take you away." The horse's good eye seemed to understand. Or maybe Jim just wanted to believe it did. He climbed into the paddock and Phantom met him in the middle. Jim wrapped his arms around the horse's neck and held on while something inside him that had been clenched tight for 12 years finally let go. He cried for the men he'd lost, for the years he'd wasted, for the family he'd abandoned, for the pain he'd carried that he'd finally found a way to set down. And Phantom stood there, solid and real and alive, holding him up the way Jim had been holding the horse up for months. They saved each other, that's what Maggie had said, and she was right. That evening, the team gathered for dinner. Walt had brought steaks to grill, a celebration even though none of them had the energy to really celebrate. They were too exhausted, too emotionally wrung out. But as they sat around the table, eating and talking quietly, Jim felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. He felt at home. Rachel sat next to him, their shoulders touching. At some point during dinner, she leaned over and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Jim couldn't speak, just nodded and felt his eyes well up again. The news that night led with Crane's courtroom breakdown, video of him being escorted out, still ranting, analysis from legal experts about the criminal charges he was likely facing, interviews with former employees who suddenly felt safe enough to come forward. Within a week, the FBI arrested Crane on racketeering charges. Carlos Mendoza had agreed to testify. The threat finally lifted. Other witnesses emerged from hiding. The case against him was overwhelming. 3 months later, Thomas Crane was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. His business empire collapsed. His properties were seized. His name became synonymous with cruelty and corruption. And on a ranch in Wyoming, a gray and white horse learned to trust again. Jim stayed at Redemption Ridge. Maggie made him co-director of the expanded program they were building with the settlement money from Crane's seized assets. They took in more horses, more veterans, created a model that other ranches started copying. Rachel moved to Wyoming permanently, opened her own practice in town, but spent most of her time at the ranch. She and Jim had coffee together every morning, didn't talk about the past much, focused on building something new. 8 months after the trial, on a cool October morning, Jim put a saddle on Phantom for the first time. The horse tensed but didn't panic, accepted the weight, accepted the trust that implied. Jim swung into the saddle and Phantom stood steady. Then slowly, carefully, they walked together around the paddock, one step at a time, building confidence, building partnership. By the time they completed a full circle, Maggie and Rachel and Ben and Sarah and Walt were all watching from the fence, tears on their faces. "How does it feel?" Maggie called out. Jim looked down at Phantom, at the scars that would never fully fade, at the blind eye that was a permanent reminder of what had been done. Then he looked at the good eye, bright and calm and forward-looking. "It feels like freedom," Jim said. A year after the trial, Redemption Ridge had grown into something beyond what any of them had imagined. 20 horses, 30 veterans cycling through 6-month programs, a waiting list of people desperate for the kind of healing that happened when broken souls found each other. Jim led a session with a new arrival, a young woman named Maria who'd lost her arm in Syria and her hope shortly after. She stood at Phantom's paddock, scared and uncertain. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "Neither did I," Jim told her. "But you're not doing it alone. Phantom here, he's been where you are, broken, scared, convinced there's no way back, and he found one. You can too." He opened the gate. "Come meet him." Maria stepped inside, hesitant. Phantom walked over and lowered his head, let her touch him with her remaining hand. She started to cry. "He understands," she whispered. "Yeah," Jim said, "he does." That night, Jim sat on the porch of the main house with Maggie. The stars were brilliant overhead, the kind of Wyoming sky that made you feel small and infinite at the same time. "You ever think about your husband?" Jim asked. "Your son?" "Every day," Maggie said. "Daniel would have loved what we've built here. He always believed in second chances, in redemption." Jim went very still, Daniel. My son, Captain Daniel Henson. He died in Iraq in 2006. Jim felt the world tilt. The name, the rank, the year. Ramadi. Maggie looked at him, and in the porch light he saw the truth in her eyes. She'd known. From the very first day. She'd known who he was. You were his commanding officer, Maggie said quietly. Major James Lattimer. You led the mission where he died. Jim couldn't breathe. You knew this whole time. From the moment you introduced yourself. I'd read the reports, seen your name. When you showed up here broken and looking for work, I recognized you. Why didn't you say anything? Because I saw what you were carrying. I saw that you blamed yourself for something that wasn't your fault, and I knew that telling you wouldn't help either of us, so I gave you work, gave you purpose, gave you Phantom, gave you a chance to save something instead of just carrying loss. Jim stood up, paced to the edge of the porch. I got your son killed. No, war got my son killed. Bad intelligence got my son killed. The same war that's been killing men for generations got Daniel. You were just the officer in command when it happened. That doesn't make you responsible. How can you say that? How can you even look at me? Maggie stood and walked over to him. Because I've watched you for a year. I've watched you save Phantom. I've watched you rebuild yourself. I've watched you help other veterans find their way back. And I've seen that you're a good man who made the best decisions he could in an impossible situation. Daniel wouldn't want you to spend your life punishing yourself for his death. He'd want you to do exactly what you're doing. Living, helping, making something good from the wreckage. She put her hand on his shoulder. I forgave you a long time ago, Jim, for something that wasn't even your fault. Maybe it's time you forgave yourself. Jim broke down then, all the years of guilt pouring out. Maggie held him the way she'd held Phantom that first day, steady and strong, waiting for the storm to pass. When he finally pulled himself together, she smiled at him. Daniel used to say that redemption isn't about erasing what we've done. It's about what we do next. So what are you going to do next, Jim? Jim looked out at the ranch, at the lights in the bunkhouse where veterans were sleeping without nightmares for the first time in years, at the paddocks where horses were learning to trust again, at the future they were building from broken pieces. I'm going to keep going, he said. Keep helping, keep healing, keep honoring Daniel's belief in second chances by giving them to everyone who comes through that gate. Maggie nodded. Then you're doing right by him and by yourself. 2 years after the trial, on a bright spring morning, Jim rode Phantom across the open pasture behind the ranch. They moved together now, unified, the horse responding to the slightest pressure, trusting completely. They reached the top of a hill that overlooked the valley. Jim dismounted and stood next to Phantom, hand on the horse's neck, looking out at the landscape. We made it, he said quietly, all the way through from broken to whole. Phantom snorted, shook his mane, and Jim laughed. It felt good to laugh, natural. He pulled out his phone and took a photo. Him and Phantom, silhouetted against the Wyoming sky. He sent it to Rachel with a simple message. Where we started, where we are now. Her response came immediately. Proud of you, Dad. Dad, she'd been calling him that for about 6 months now. Every time she did, it felt like a gift. Jim put his phone away and swung back into the saddle. They rode down the hill toward the ranch, toward home, toward whatever came next. Behind them the past remained. The scars, the losses, the pain, all of it still there, still real, still part of who they were. But ahead was open country, possibility, life. And that was enough. That was everything. They rode into the ranch yard just as the dinner bell rang. Rachel was on the porch, waving. Inside, Maggie was setting the table. Ben and Sarah were bringing horses in for the night. Walt sat in his usual spot, surveying his kingdom with satisfaction. Jim dismounted, took care of Phantom, made sure he had hay and water. The horse nudged him gently, a gesture that had become their good-night ritual. "See you in the morning," Jim said. Phantom's good eye watched him walk away, calm and trusting. And Jim Lattimer, 54 years old, former soldier, recovering addict of guilt and grief, walked into the warm light of the house where his daughter waited and his found family gathered, and felt something that had eluded him for 2 decades. He felt peace. Not the absence of pain, not the erasure of scars, but the hard one, fought for, earned through blood and tears, peace of a man who'd been to hell and climbed back out. That night, for the first time in 12 years, Jim Lattimer slept without nightmares. And in the paddock outside, a gray and white horse with one good eye stood in the moonlight, no longer alone, no longer afraid. Just alive. Just free. Just home.